Welcome back to those of you who were with us yesterday, and welcome to those who are just joining us today. This is the second day of our symposium, Impressions of Empire, Works on Paper as Agents of Intermedial Translation and Cultural Exchange. The symposium is sponsored and organized jointly by the Colnaghi Foundation and Athena Art Foundation. I'm Irene Brooke. I'm editor of Colnaghi Studies Journal, in which some of these papers will ultimately be published as a special thematic volume. We had a wonderful day yesterday, barring some technical difficulties. Thank you to those of you who sort of stayed with us throughout that. But we really had a rich set of talks addressing an incredibly wide range of materials, ranging from kind of interactive Venetian courtesan flat prints to botanical cyanotypes to contract drawings in New Spain. And all of our speakers really explored how these wide range of works engaged in really complex ways with different imperial agendas and matrices of power. We're going to try and stick a little bit more to schedule today. Hopefully everything will run more smoothly from terms of technology. I think it will, because not doing a hybrid thing is much more straightforward. So I want, without further ado, though, to introduce our first speaker, who also will want to go to bed soon. So Victoria Adams, who is joining us from New Zealand. Victoria recently received her doctorate in art history from the University of Auckland, Waipapa Taumata Rao. Researching the cultural impact of the British art section of the 1906-1907 New Zealand International Exhibition, with a thesis entitled British Art for British Tastes, the British art section of the 1906-1907 New Zealand International Exhibition. She's worked in art galleries and is particularly interested in the procurement of British art as the foundation for New Zealand's nascent art collections. She's extremely passionate about her research and enjoys sharing it with others. And the topic of her talk today will be the subject of her PhD, this exhibition in 1906-1907. So over to you, Victoria. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you can hopefully share your presentation with us.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Irene. Okay, so as Irene said in the introduction, I'll be talking about the British art section of the 1906-7 New Zealand International Exhibition, which I wrote my PhD thesis on and graduated a couple of weeks ago, which is very exciting. The 1906 exhibition was one of a number which occurred around the world throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and was planned at the behest of then New Zealand Premier Richard Seddon. Seddon really wanted to show off New Zealand's greatness to the world after a strong economic recovery from depression in the 1880s and the introduction of a number of progressive social welfare reforms, such as old age pensions. There were many different facets to the exhibition, such as trade, industry, and education, but art was the key cultural element of the exhibition. So organised by the British government and paid for by the New Zealand government, the British art section of the 1906-1907 New Zealand International Exhibition remains the largest exhibition of British art in New Zealand's history. It featured almost 2,000 artworks in a collection valued at over £100,000, which is over 20 million New Zealand dollars today. A principal motivation of the exhibit was to educate colonial viewers on what good art was within the empire, and to cater to a market of middle-class art buyers nostalgic for home. So today I will discuss how the artworks exhibited in the British art section played a pivotal role in the shaping of both public and private art collections during the early 20th century in New Zealand. I've selected a few key artworks, both works on paper and on canvas, for my talk today. Some of the most popular artworks included in the British art section, and those which not only promoted the virtues of British art, but of the British Empire itself. The exhibition has been described as being a conscious attempt by an increasingly confident nation to proclaim its greatness. And as part of this greatness, the colony of New Zealand portrayed itself as a principally British country, loyal to the empire and extolling British values, standards, and culture. It was the Britain of the South. So this idea fits well within what local historian James Belich calls New Zealand's recolonisation process. Now, recolonisation references a form of colonisation by economic, ideological, and cultural means which continue long after the colonisation of land has ended. So the compression of time and space afforded by Victorian technological innovations such as the steam engine and the telegram allowed colonial New Zealand to become ever closer to Britain, importing British culture through newspapers, books, journals, art reproductions, and international exhibitions. So New Zealand had already imported British cultural and values and tastes as a result of colonisation. However, during its recolonisation period, New Zealand settlers reinforced their British identities and the ideology that British taste, the taste of empire, was best. So another local historian, Felicity Barnes, has extended on this recolonisation argument somewhat, arguing that New Zealand settlers saw themselves as co-owners of the British Empire and of old British culture and heritage, with London effectively becoming the colony's cultural capital. So British taste, the taste of empire, became eagerly sought after by New Zealand settlers wishing to reinforce their Britishness through their enthusiasm shown for British culture, often represented by the rapidly growing middle classes purchasing British art for their public and private collections. So in order to preface the idea that British art was the real art at the exhibition, we need to take a quick look at how exhibition organisers viewed art by New Zealand artists. So artworks by New Zealand artists were exhibited throughout the exhibition space, not only in the specially built art gallery. And they were used largely to promote the colony's natural beauty and act as advertisements for New Zealand tourism. One of the exhibition organisers, Thomas Don, was the head of the government's Department of Tourists and Health Resorts, and he was particularly after paintings and artworks which were based on pictorial accuracy and not their artistic qualities. So artworks in the Colonial art section of the art gallery were by members of New Zealand and Australian art societies who were each allotted a set amount of space, and the works exhibited were largely recently completed works looking to be sold and were not a survey of artistic development in the colony. The Colonial art section received very little attention in the press, and I especially love this quote on the slide here, which essentially tells readers that it's not that bad. The Colonial art is not as bad as you might think. There was also a clear absence of artworks by Māori artists. There was no Māori art in the exhibition art gallery. Carvings by Māori artists in the exhibition space were used as decoration and kind of as a cultural point of difference from other white settler colonies. So the British art section was organised by Sir Isidore Spelman, who was an Englishman with extensive prior experience organising art exhibits for the British government at earlier international exhibitions. Artworks were largely by members of British art institutions such as the Royal Academy, Royal Watercolour Society and Royal Scottish Academy. And I've included a breakdown here of the artworks exhibited and a layout of the art gallery here. These three rooms that aren't labelled, they were the only three reserved for the colonial art. So most of the artworks were for sale. Artists advised the purchase price for their works and gave a minimum sale price that artworks could be sold for in order to effect quick sales, they were really trying to extend, they were trying out a new market for British art basically, and really trying to see what would happen in one of its furthest colonies. So works on paper proved the most popular, while a substantial 52 out of 233 oil paintings were purchased. Works on paper sold in the largest quantities. Almost half of the 209 watercolours exhibited were purchased, as were over a third of the 309 drawings, etchings and engravings, thus demonstrating not only the popularity of such works in the colony, but the importance placed on them by those responsible for Australasia's nascent art collections. Buyers from art societies and galleries in Christchurch, Wellington, Auckland and Dunedin, the Art Gallery of New South Wales and the Art Gallery of South Australia, together with numerous private collectors, spent over £5,600, which is almost 1.2 million New Zealand dollars today, on works on paper from the British art section. So watercolours were exhibited in 2 rooms, as seen here, and in his report on the British art section at the conclusion of the exhibition, Spearman noted that if the public showed a preference at all, it was for the watercolour section, where several of the subject pictures could have been sold many times over. Idyllic rural scenes proved the most popular imagery in the British art section. The pictures of bucolic country landscapes and pleasant farmyard scenes flooded the British art market at that time in response to Victorian anxieties surrounding industrialisation and urbanisation, two of examples of which are seen here. And I might add that all of the artworks that I have included in my slides from now on were all purchased from the exhibition. New Zealand historian Felicity Barnes has noted how these images became portable icons of England for those who had left home, and argued that, quote, these portable icons of an imagined and essentialized England did not simply journey out to reform settler landscapes as models of home. They made a round trip, tucked safely in the imaginations of white settler colonials travelling to the centre, end quote. So her research demonstrates that these countryside scenes had a lasting impact on New Zealand settlers and coloured their view of home, further arguing how colonial New Zealand had a greater interest in reconstructing its own rural Arcadia as part of its identity as Britain of the South. So essentially, these works in the British art section evoked a sense of nostalgia for home, being Britain. Helen Allingham's watercolour paintings provide a perfect example of this. Allingham had 2 picturesque, romanticised country and cottage scenes included in the British art section, one of which is seen here on the left, and both of which were purchased by private women art collectors. Her pictures were intimate and informal and held a nostalgic charm for contemporary purchasers. Further, reminiscences of British cottage scenes would have greatly appealed to New Zealand's settler audience, with Allingham's paintings perhaps replicating a cottage they left behind. On the right here, this landscape among the hills by Edward Davies is a notable landscape to include in my discussion today, because it was only one of 2 watercolours and an etching purchased by the Dunedin Public Art Gallery. At that time, they had very little money available to buy new artworks, so it's significant to note this as a purchase. They considered it, quote, a very fine, strong picture of mountain scenery, end quote. So, as well as landscapes, there were images of important British landmarks, which were also purchased. The Houses of Parliament by William Hale was purchased for the Canterbury Society of Arts by former New Zealand Premier Sir John Hall, who had spent time in Britain recuperating from ill health before returning to New Zealand and re-entering Parliament, where I think one of his greatest achievements was to pilot the bill for women's suffrage. So I think the Houses of Parliament here, illustrating the home of the government of the British Empire, was an appropriate choice for the man who devoted so much of his life to New Zealand's colonial government. Artworks were also included by key British art figures such as Frederick Lord Leighton, John Everett Millay, Edward Burne-Jones, and George Frederick Watts. So the former Royal Academy President Leighton was well known in New Zealand at the time and prior, as his activities in London at the Royal Academy were frequently reported on in New Zealand papers, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales had already begun acquiring artworks for their collection. So three drawings on the right here by Leighton, quite beautiful studies, I think. They were purchased for the Art Gallery of South Australia's collection, whose honorary curator at that time focused on selecting a representative collection of works by artists from Britain's different art schools. And the oil painting on the right, Terracina, was purchased immediately by the Canterbury Society of Arts, who had actually written to Leighton over 20 years earlier asking for his help in selecting artworks for them to buy for their own budding art collection. So finally and briefly, the most overt examples demonstrating the empire were images of royal pageantry and processions. So these are images of, as seen here, the funeral procession of Queen Victoria. They were presented to New Zealanders as works of the greatest national interest. So for colonial viewers on the other side of the world, they were a way to bring British subjects closer to the centre of the empire and the London metropole and connect with scenes from home. This painting in particular was extremely popular, with one local newspaper calling it one of the principal attractions in the art gallery and singling it out because of the important moment it depicted, together with the portraits of prime royal and military figures in the foreground, as well as the fact that it showed St. James's Palace in the background, the quote official headquarters of the British Empire. It was hoped that New Zealand would purchase it, and the artist himself thought that the painting should be in the colonies and lowered the price from 1,000 guineas to £700 to help facilitate its sale, but unfortunately it was too expensive for New Zealand's art societies. There was this image here of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee procession was purchased, however, by the Art Gallery of New South Wales, whose director considered the artwork to be stylistically which the limits of Impressionism should be carried. However, one Australian commentator at the time thought that its acquisition must have been brought surely to our national, must have been brought surely to show our national patriotism, for on no artistic grounds could its presence be accounted for, end quote. So it wasn't necessarily popular. So the reception of these sorts of paintings at the exhibition also served to reinforce the image of New Zealand as a loyal and patriotic colony to Britain. So a report on the exhibition in the British Times noted that special efforts were made to send works such as these, and confirmed with British readers that these artworks were a continual source of fascination and admiration to the patriotic people of New Zealand. So readers at home could therefore rest assured with the knowledge that New Zealand was a proud British colony. Okay, so I'd better wrap up because I've gone over time. But in conclusion, the British Arts section was a resounding success, as evidenced by the total sale price of over £17,000, which was the largest amount ever spent at an international exhibition at that time. And its popularity and success disseminated British artistic tastes and traditions in New Zealand and Australia, further enmeshing colonial New Zealand's identity as a Britain of the South. The significant cultural exchange worked to reinforce the desire for British art in New Zealand and the artistic tastes of New Zealand settlers as inherently British. Bucolic watercolour landscapes, nostalgic from home, engravings and drawings of popular British landmarks, as only a few examples, were exhibited to evoke the strong cultural ties between the empire and its far-flung colony. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that wonderful paper.
Thank you.
And we'll have time for questions after the second talk, and you can also put questions into the Q&A to our viewers. But we will, I'd like to now introduce our second speaker in this first session. Chandni Jeswani is an architectural historian and curator based in Dubai. She holds an MA in History of Art with Curating from Birkbeck University here in London. Her current research explores the afterlives of genius loci in South Asia through sacred cartography, vernacular print, oral history, and digital visual culture. Her dissertation examined Varanasi's ritual and spatial construction via pilgrim maps as instruments of mnemonic continuity and colonial translation. She also researches Sindhi displacement and diasporic aesthetics with broader interests in sacred space, visual cultures of patronage, and contested placemaking. She's worked with the Al Serkal Art Foundation, Dubai Design Week, and Art Dubai, focusing on para-institutional curatorial practice. And she's going to deliver a paper today entitled Mapping Kashi Pilgrimage Cartographies and Cultural Translations on Paper. So Chandni, do you want to share your screen with us, your presentation?
Yes, sure. Can you see my screen?
I think I can, yeah, it says you're sharing, yes, but
I'll just give it a minute to boot up.
perfect.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm joining you from Dubai.
Wonderful.
And as explained, I'm an architectural historian, and I'm most interested in very broadly how communities narrate, negotiate, and preserve space across time, displacement, and transformation. And that makes my work not cleanly architectural history, but not cleanly art either. And it's a very interesting intersection to populate. What I bring to you today is essentially a study of my city of interest, which is the city of Varanasi. It's also called Kashi and Banaras, which is a city in Uttar Pradesh in India. And I explore how it's been visually represented across 3 different types of media and what that speaks to how we understand cities, especially sacred cities. And what I would like to start off with is to introduce you to this city using a quote. Nothing anywhere in this universe is more charming than this city. It's presided over by God himself. This city is separated from the world. It rests on the trident of God, and who will save it from dissolution. It will be forever auspicious and never forsaken. I use this quote as an example of the hegemony of this city in Hindu thought. It's known by various names. It's known as Banaras, it's known as Anandvan, it's known as Varanasi, and it is mythic and material at the same time. There's ritual, there's politics, there's history, and it's a very rich area of expertise. Its temples, ghats, and alleys have been imagined as a copy of the Hindu universe, and it's believed to, as is evidenced by the quote, to be resting on God's trident himself, and it promises liberation to those who die within its bound. But my interest is not in how it was mythically imagined, but my interest lies in what the city is today, because these cities and sacred cities are unique in this, is that um, they're not just places which belong in history, but are places which are lived. And these are shaped by colonial intervention, by modernization, and by global imaginations as well. And each time that the city is represented, be it through a map, be it through prints, be it through paintings, there is an active negotiation that happens while we represent these cities. So every representation of Banaras not just depicts Banaras, but it also constructs what the city means, depending on who's looking, be it a pilgrim, be it an administrator, or be it someone distant in another city who's viewing this representation. What's unique about Banaras is that it's very romanticized in popular religious and academic writing. It's known as the oldest continually inhabited city on earth. It's known as older than history, older than time, quintessentially Indian, more often Hindu. And when it comes to visually depicting it, that's why the process gets complicated, because each image and the image making methodology as well needs to make a choice of what to show, what to frame, what to omit. And that makes the city's identity constantly contested and reframed. To explore this in more detail, I pick up three representations from the 18th and 19th centuries. The first is a pilgrim map, a lithograph called Kashi Darpan, which means the mirror of Kashi, which is a devotional map which embeds ritual circuits and pilgrimage circuits into modern print. The second is an 1822 survey map, which translates the city into grids and coordinates so that it could be administered better by the colonial government at that point. And the third is an aquatant of Dasashwamedh Ghat, one of the riverbanks of Kashi, and it frames Banaras through the picturesque methodology for European consumption. Each medium not only shows how the city looks like, but it also encodes different ways of looking. So aesthetic spectacle, rationality, or cosmology. And that will help us understand Banaras as a visual field where it doesn't sit cleanly in one category, but intersects within all of these. The choices of these three images are very deliberate. There are a lot of representations which are made of Banaras during this period. And it is, as I mentioned, rich fodder for image making because it offers multiple points of capitalization. For pilgrims, you can create sacred prints. For administrators, surveys were being made for taxation and governance. And for European audiences, views were made so that they could take a piece of this exotic city back with them. The city is so famous as being a sacred center and having a uniquely dense urban fabric, and thus it becomes a rich subject for which each constituency could project its claim to knowledge. And looking at these three, we can then enable a comparative and intermedial approach, and we can ask what's being depicted and how medium, audience, and positionality can reframe this city. So to condense my inquiry within a question, how do different visual media mediate sacredness of Banaras, and what do their representational strategies reveal about the epistemological, political, and aesthetic frameworks of their time? And to address this, I'll, as I mentioned, be using an intermedial lens because it'll allow us to see the power of these images as instruments of power and meaning. And the primary argument really is to ensure that Banaras emerges not just as this timeless entity, but as a constantly negotiated, contested, and renegotiated field of visual imagination, and more importantly and widely understanding sacred cities as places where sacredness is not fixed, but it's repeatedly produced. With that introduction in mind, I am going to take you to our first visual representation, which is called the Kashi Darpan. Translated, it means the mirror of Kashi. I'll be using the terms Banaras, Kashi, and Varanasi interchangeably, so please bear with me. This map is published in 1876, and it is a vernacular system of representation because it is a pilgrimage map. It is one in a long line of this diagrammatic way of representing almost an itinerary of sacred spots to visit. And it was produced at the height of colonial cartography. And what it shows is essentially a cosmogram. It shows a city which consists of shrines, pilgrimage circuits which connect these shrines, and a larger ritual geography which connects all of these places together. So it is not just about the individual shrines, but also about how these individual shrines form a Hindu mosaic. And this map of the universe, to say, is, as I mentioned, it comes in a long line of map making, which is a vernacular system. And this mix of text and diagrams was supposed to guide pilgrims on where to go. But what's unique about this is that it uses a relatively modern, for that period, print medium, lithography, which gives it not just the devotional authority to speak of this information, but also the ability for this to be circulated. Why this map is unique also is because it tries to mediate between cosmology and modern urban planning. So you have the concentric circles which are showing Banaras as a cosmic center. It seems that there is something in the center which pulls all of this together and forms a Hindu mosaic, which is the temple of Kashi Vishwanath, which sits in the center. And there are also pathways and sacred sites which are organized by some kind of logic, which is the logic of the feet of the pilgrim. So these are access where the pilgrims can walk. So this map is somewhere between cosmology and spatial practice. It's a diagram and an itinerary at the same time. And the reason why it's so thickly populated and so abundant is just to express the religious power of Kashi, that there are so many shrines that at each step a pilgrim finds another shrine. What's important also to note is that not just mythic shrines which are mentioned in ritual texts are included, but also contemporary colonial era constructions are included. Ghats which are riverbanks which were built and renovated under British patronage, and structures like the town hall, civic structures, all of these were also inserted into this cosmic map. One might assume that this dilutes the sacred authority of the map, but this is an amazing way of expressing how Banaras incorporates everything into its sacredness. By folding all of this new architecture into this cosmogram, it's ensured that colonial modernity is also absorbed into the sacred geography. And that makes it unique in map making in general, because it resists and adapts at the same time. It's resisting the erasure of sacred knowledge by encoding these indigenous cartographies into this map, but it also adapts by displaying what Sokol saw when he was drawing this map, which is the altered cityscape of Banaras at that point. Lithography is a method which is used for this map, which is essential to note because it was introduced in India at the early 19th century, and it allowed for cheaper and more detailed prints to be circulated. It could capture this density in more detail because a lot of the details, as you can see in the zoom-ins, are quite granular, and these could be reproduced then at scale, and this map could then be distributed to pilgrims. A lot of these maps used to then be hung at homes, and it was almost like the sacredness of Kashi could then be taken back as a souvenir. So that's why lithography was an important method to use for this map of Banaras, because at one point a city could both be cartographically and cosmologically expressed. What's important here to note as well is that it's counter cartography in a sense, because this is Sukul's Banaras. It's not really the Banaras which was being graphed by colonial surveys at that point, which I will come to. It still offers the modern Banaras because additions are included, but it's deeply rooted in cartography. So to sum up, it exemplifies really how these indigenous traditions could be reframed through new technologies. And as I mentioned, it shows that Banaras is not a place that's frozen in this mythic past, but it's actively being reimagined. And this is a commodity, it's an itinerary, it's a cosmogram, and it makes sacred geography and this map of the universe into a portable, reproducible object. It's a mirror of Kashi, which reflects and also redefines this sacred city. To stress all of your eyes a little more, I will take you to the next representation. And this is James Princip's 1822 survey map. If Sukul's Kashi Darpan shows you sacred cosmology, this one shows you streets, plots, and measurements. Produced during Princep's service with the East India Company, it shows the rationalizing gaze of colonial cartography. Mapping for the East India Company was not just descriptive, but instrumental as well. It rendered cities legible for administration, taxation, and control. During this time, when this map was created, colonial cities were being mapped with the same rationalizing gaze. So Calcutta, Madras, Delhi, all of these were being mapped as an imperial project. And this was then a way of naturalizing British authority. Knowledge was being rewritten that justified governance. At this point, especially with Kashi Darpan so fresh in our minds, it's very clear what's been excluded. So sacred sites, temples, and ritual circuits. The features that structure the city for its inhabitants are absent, and the map then flattens Banaras into a topographical surface. The Ganga becomes a boundary, the Ghat becomes just a built structure, and the streets just become about circulation. And that makes Banaras a city that is knowable, and more importantly, that's governable. So erasure is not just accidental, it's epistemic, because this is not a document which is made to communicate sacredness, it's made to service administrators, tax collectors, engineers. So there is a geometric calm that's enforced through the document, and the irregularities and the sharp edges of the city are then ordered. Especially when we compare it with Sukul, where it's saturated with shrines and circuits, Princeps survey then silences these. So one is about excess, the other is about austerity. And it's also, as I mentioned, it services different audiences. So for a pilgrim, this is completely illegible as a map of the sacred city. But for a colonial administrator, Sukul's Kashi Darpan then becomes useless. So, of course, this shows the cartographic imperative of the empire to replace those indigenous ways of knowing with a more technical epistemology. And Princep himself is a very interesting maker of these maps because he was an administrator and an antiquarian. So he was a double technical expert figure. So it shows authority twice over, first by erasing indigenous cartographies and saying, no, this is a better way of doing things. And medium also is an important point to note for this map because this was an engraving. So Sukul's lithograph, which was made for circulation, this one was made for careful and bureaucratic use. The epistemology was not cosmological, but administrative. So this map, to sum up, epitomizes the colonial project of making India knowable and measurable. So it's not the Banaras, which is Shiva's city, which is a map of the universe, but this is a governable urban space. And it shows the imperial stakes of cartography to domesticate the unruly and sacred city by reimagining it as abstracted property. To take you to the next visual representation and to give your eyes a little calm, hopefully, is to show you this aquatant by Thomas Daniel, which is called Dasaswamedh Ghat. And if Princep rationalizes Banaras into coordinates and Sukul makes its sacred cartography, Thomas Daniel reframes the city as aesthetic spectacle. So this aquatant was published in 1796. It was part of the Oriental Scenery series, and it captures the ghat from the river. A ghat is a term which is used for steps which lead down to the riverbank. And it's a very carefully staged composition. You have this monumental architectural piece which rises in tiers. It's softened by atmospheric light, and you can see small groups of figures which are clustered at the water's edge. The ghat is a very important and deliberate choice. This is one of the most important ritual ghats of Banaras because Banaras also centers upon the worship of the river itself. So it is a ritually charged space while being visually dramatic. And for a European audience, it offered exactly what the picture has demanded. It was striking architecture, ritual activity, and the play of light on the water. And the site was, so it's, the medium of aquatant is, of course, very essential to this translation because it allows for these tonal gradations to occur, for painterly effects to come through. Unlike the hard lines of engraving, this can bring in atmosphere, haze, shadow, depth. So this made it ideal to convey India's landscapes to metropolitan audiences, which were hungry not just for exoticism, but also for some kind of accuracy. So aquatint then becomes not just a technical choice, but becomes a way to package Banaras within the aesthetic conventions that were existing. But of course, this marks a sharp distinction from what we've been seeing. Lithography was being used to integrate the shrines, and Sanskrit text was used to make a cosmogram which is portable. Prinsep was using engraving for precision. Daniel is using aquatints to create artworks for sale in London, essentially. So, of course, we must note that each medium was being used for a different audience and for a different purpose. And for example, perspective also changes how we understand the image here. And because his view is taken essentially from the river, it's taken at eye level. It does not attempt the God level abstraction which happens during the survey or the cosmic overview of the ritual diagram. And it allows you to picture yourself as a traveler floating upon the Ganga and looking at the city as a spectacle. So it can be argued that sacredness is not completely erased, like in the case of Prinsep, but it can be argued that it does aestheticize Banaras. Pilgrims, priests, all of these actors are present, but these are passive, they are objects and are staffage within the scene. So visually, we can see a lot of domestication here. It's a timeless riverine city, light and shadow, and it then becomes an object for consumption for audiences. It becomes less a record of a sacred site, but becomes then a commodity in the imperial art market. And the spiritual density of the Dasashwamedh Ghat is then repurposed as visual pleasure, and the rituals and the activity that happens on the Ghat becomes just decorative flourish. A way to understand how these three individuals saw the city is to see one site across all three representations. So the Dasashwamedh Ghat, as I mentioned before, is a set of monumental steps which lead down to the river, and they are very charged points spiritually for rituals to occur. So Daniel looks at them as monumental architecture. In Prinsep's map, that's where it is, but within all of the notations, you can't really see it because it's reduced to an abstracted structure. In Sukul, you can see how the architecture of the Ghat is highlighted because it has importance within the cosmological network. So when we see these three at the same time, we see three different types of Banaras which come in with three different media, with three different audiences and possessionality. So the aquatint transforms Banaras into a spectacle, Prinsep makes it a data set, and Sukul makes it the map of the universe. And Dasashwamedh Ghat, the aquatint, then exemplifies this Orientalist picturesque gaze. It makes Banaras legible not only through ritual, not through ritual knowledge or order, but through the aesthetic of the sublime. And this then helps me complete a triad of different ways of looking at Banaras. Sukul sacralizes, Prinsep rationalizes, and Daniel aestheticizes. And the point that it helps us make is that Banaras was and is never singular in representation. It's always contested, reframed, and consumed differently across visual traditions. And the idea is that Banaras as a sacred city is not just represented through these modes, but is remade. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. And the idea is that these are not just records, shots in time of Banaras's history, but also form its history itself. It shaped how the city was seen, how it was understood, how it was inhabited. For pilgrims, the pilgrim map is mapping salvation. For administrators, the survey is mapping property. For collectors, the aquatint mapped something that they owned. So each audience was looking at a different Banaras. And why I choose Banaras is that Kashi is known as a city of thresholds. So it sits between life and death, sacred and profane, myth and modernity. And what's interesting about it is that these images are thresholds too. They tell us as much about what was revealed as what was concealed, who was looking, what they wanted to find. And the idea behind conducting this research really is recognizing that looking at sacred cities, not just in South Asia, but in general, is to understand them beyond being timeless and eternal, but to imagine them as being reimagined continually through competing visual traditions. And sacredness is not just negotiated through ritual and text, but also through print, survey, and aquatant. So as we see, Banaras emerges as a dynamic field of visual contestation. It's sacred, it's colonial, and it's aesthetic all at once. And these images, more importantly, remind us that to study cities is not just to trace their streets and monuments, but to confront that the visions that through which they have been framed are circulated and contested continually. And Banaras, in this sense, is less an eternal city, but it is an eternally remade city in the mirror of representation. And we see that this remaking is happening in the present as well with the advent of new media. But that is a question that I will explore on another day. And that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Interesting points, and both of those talks about kind of driving us to think about the different kinds of authority that images can convey and assume. And I think both talks also really raise interesting points about the role of images in different types of colonial settings, whether sort of settler colonialism or exploitative colonialism. And I have some questions myself, but first I'd like to see if any of our speakers have questions or our audience. Yes.
I have a question. I can't pop it in the chat, so I thought I'd just take off my microphone. It's for you, Victoria. I really found your talk really interesting, being from Australia, especially. I think you talked about this, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on why you think it was important that works on paper featured so predominantly in this exhibition, and or, you know, in the kind of situations that you're talking about, and especially, you know, how much of the fact that it was works on paper being sold and acquired was due to cost, and how that cost element or that medium element affected this sense of like myth making of New Zealand, especially when you think of, you know, works on paper traditionally being seen as kind of, you know, lesser or perceived as somewhat less prestigious than, you know, sculpture or painting. And I was really interested by the comparison that you made to the painting, the oil painting that was acquired at the Art Gallery of South Australia, especially because, you know, in South Australia, in Adelaide, I think there is traditionally this sense of that city defining itself by the fact that it wasn't like an ex-convict colony and it had traditionally a lot more wealth. So, you know, you can see how they would maybe be in a position to acquire, you know, painting, whereas maybe New Zealand or other parts of Australia were acquiring paper, and how you think that this affected the sort of perception of it maybe being a new, you know, a Britain of the South, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely think cost played a factor. Spielman tried to select works that were, you know, kind of somewhat affordable. There was a painting, an oil painting sent over by Malay, which was over £3,000, and that was just way out of the price range of anyone. The most expensive artwork was purchased by the Art Gallery of New South Wales. That was about £800. But I think the New Zealand settlers, they enjoyed works on paper. Like yes, there was a hierarchy, and the way the art gallery was laid out showed that hierarchy. So watercolors were first, and then you move through to oil paintings, sculptures, came back around to drawings and engravings and some arts and crafts. But no, I think New Zealand settlers, they valued the works on paper because they were, you know, they became treasured works of art, and a lot of them still are. There was one which I didn't get the chance to include in my talk today, a watercolor by Thomas Rook, and it was huge, and it stayed within the same family. It was passed down and only sold a few years ago at auction in Christie's. So yeah, no, I think works on paper were valued, and they were important, and they still are. A lot, now are stored in the ones that were purchased by public collections are, now in drawers and kept safe and out of sight. But they do pop up every now and then, and come out for exhibition.
Can I ask, just following up on that, thinking about the kind of not so much watercolors necessarily, but kind of and drawings as kind of pedagogical tools. You think there was, I mean, I get that there's a sort of economic factor, but do you think there was any sort of consciousness of perhaps kind of works on paper being a way of training? You talked a lot about the kind of establishment of taste, and I wonder for if you're thinking about artists and their training, do you think that could have played any role?
Definitely, yes. Yeah. Art Society, especially the Canterbury Society of Arts, they were looking at artworks that would help their local artists, and as well the Art Gallery of South Australia. The honorary curator, he bought a lot of drawings and etchings with the idea of teaching his students, and he wanted the best and a wide and representative selection to teach local artists. So yes, definitely.
Okay, great. Chandni, Catherine, welcome.
Hi, good morning. I had a question for Chandni. I really like what you talk about, like the different medium and how they were used. And I was wondering, is it something you find always, like for other print or other cities, that the use of litho and yes, like, do you see this, like the distribution of engraving? I thought it was really interesting. So I thought if you could say a few more words about this.
Yeah, and just on leading on to that, how many impressions of this survive? Do you know?
Well, first, Catherine and Irene, thank you for your questions. To speak more broadly, yes, there are different systems of representations that exist for sacred cities in general. So, for example, if I take the example of Haridwar, which is another and more northern situated sacred city, you have similar types of representations. So you have a sacred map versus you have the more head-on view versus you have the survey. So definitely those ranges of modes exist. And when it comes to what survives, unfortunately, a lot of these survive as digital copies more than analog. And many of the analog copies are now either they stay in museums and libraries. The copy that I was privy to was a part of the British Museum, which I know is quite ironic considering that we were speaking of it being cartography. But the copy that I had access to was in the British Library, and another exists in the National Archives in Delhi. Some local copies, especially of the Cosmogram, are, as I mentioned, framed in houses of people in Kashi. And some of them, especially when it got scattered across the Hindu diaspora around the world, this then became almost like a souvenir, which then got passed on generation to generation. And as its content became more and more complicated to explain to the next generation, the prints were eventually discarded. When it comes to the aquaprint, it then has a life as an art print. I believe that the last I saw it was that it was in the V&A's collections. Again, quite ironic. And the survey map also lives on the British Library and is part of the Imperial collection, the afterlife of the Imperial collection. But I think more than surviving as prints, they, especially the cosmogram I can speak for, has moved on as an idea, in the sense that now it has become this extremely graphic representation, which now that we see it is not really legible as the same one, but it follows the same family. I am trying to find an image through which I can explain this a little more. And I do have something that I can show you. And these are also works on paper, but they take this idea of the cosmic map and then carry it forward. So to answer your question, they don't really survive, but the idea lives on as this very hypergraphic way of representation. And as you see the top, they are now, instead of being a lithograph, they are being Xeroxed their ways through.
In terms of just kind of practical function, this is sort of reveals my ignorance of this type of artwork, but you sort of describe it as a pilgrim map, but in terms of practicality, would it really ever have been used as such, or was it, I mean, did it carry a sort of sacred weight inherently? What was the sort of function, I guess, of this type of work?
So the function was twofold. The first is, it is not a itinerary in the typical sense, but it is almost like a checklist that these are especially in, I can speak about Kashi in particular, where there is a specific pilgrimage circuit which is believed to be exceptionally meritorious. And the idea is that if you follow just the maps on the border, that's the first circuit. If you follow the maps just in this area, that's another pilgrimage circuit. So essentially, this map would then be used as a checklist in that regard. And more importantly, it then became, as I mentioned, it spoke of why it reflects why Kashi is as holy as it is. It's not due to the presence of one specific temple in that specific place. And it's because there are so many temples which are concentrated in one area. And that is an oversimplification, because it is believed that every sacred site in India has its copy in Kashi, which happens through a process called spatial transposition. And essentially the entire universe, which includes every god, every animal, every plant, has its mode of devotion in Kashi, and essentially all of these temples represent that. So when you traverse the land of Kashi, that you would cover all of these. So the idea is not just to represent in a cartographical sense of what happens. Of course, there is an intention there to be legible to that, but is to express this Hindu mosaic idea. The second one was its souvenir function, which is also the afterlife of not just this, but of the representations that I showed you just now, which came after it, is that you carry a piece of Kashi and its sacredness with you. Essentially, it's believed that even representations of the entire universe's temples they mean something devotionally, and they hold sacred weight. And it was believed that having this Kashi Darpan in your house would ward away evil and would bring good tidings. I do have a copy, and things have been going well, so I can assume that it was working. But yes, it does. I think one of the main, speaking as a Hindu myself, one of the things that it really has shown me, and of course has shown pilgrims in the past as well, from what I have read, is that it impressed upon them the size of the Hindu universe and how it could move across different types of scales. So the universe could be condensed to a city, the city could be condensed to a map, and it really depended just on perspective. So I hope that answered your question.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, Nicola. You're muted.
Yeah, I know. I was just unmuting. Yes, thank you. So both really interesting talks. I would like to make a comment to Victoria in a minute, but I'll start with Chandni because of what you've been talking about. And I just wondered, do you happen to know, you talked about how these maps have moved forward, in terms of developments, but do you know how how old this tradition is in India. Because the reason I ask is because I work on the 16th and 17th century in Europe and in
Mm-hmm.
Spain in particular. But I know that people brought back, even from the time of the Crusades, people were bringing back these kind of routes, these maps, sacred maps, about Christ's pilgrimage, the route of the cross. And famously, somebody brought one back to Seville, and that became used for a kind of an itinerary that people who couldn't make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, would make a small symbolic pilgrimage in Seville. They didn't actually have a map, but it was kind of recorded knowledge. And in fact, they'd brought back the particular man who went to Jerusalem brought back a sort of measurement, which was a kind of synecdoche for the whole map. But I'm also thinking a little bit around the same time in Germany, somebody produced, Hartman Schädel produced this printed document called the what was it called? The
Nuremberg Chronicle? No.
sorry, the Nuremberg Chronicle. Yeah, the Nuremberg Chronicle, which has a map which is remarkably similar to the one that you show of Jerusalem. So I'm just wondering where there's a sort of intercultural tradition of these pilgrimage maps, and and this idea that bringing them back or having a copy can also be a kind of it becomes almost like a relic. It becomes something that brings good luck, that protects you, that is a direct contact to some kind of saintly cosmological presence. So I thought that was really interesting.
As you say, I think in the European context, certainly the maps, one could make a kind of virtual pilgrimage through meditation, contemplative viewing of the map and thinking about the sites and
Yeah.
And
more importantly, Varanasi as a city had a lot of Buddhist influence as well. So the idea of the mandala comes from Buddhism, which is a circular visual representation which aids meditation. So this idea of representing the cosmos of Varanasi in a circular form is believed to also come from there, because we were speaking about pilgrimages which were circuitous in nature. But when it comes to pilgrim maps in general, they were drawn. The earliest example that I have seen is from 9th century CE, but also around this time, why this one is specific and very unique in its conceptualization is that around this time, Varanasi was seeing a period of relative calm, because before that we had a lot of invaders, a lot of iconoclasm of temples, we had a lot of temples broken down. So right after that, we see this rush to codify sacred knowledge of what existed, at least into more pictorial forms, because we didn't know if the sacred space would remain tomorrow. But in Hindu thought, it is not just about the physical structure, it is about the divinity which is imbibed into that area more very broadly. In a very broad brush way of speaking, it's almost like saying once a temple, always a temple, because if the area and the land remains, then once a temple, always a temple. So essentially, starting from the 9th century CE, we start seeing this drive to represent the sacred cosmology of Kashi visually. But we see around the 15th and 16th century the rewriting of ritual texts, which are then translated into the Kashi Darpan. But this again is a more, as you pointed out, a very hybrid way of representation, because it takes the Buddhist idea of the mandala forward into a more cosmic, into representing it as a model of the universe. And so initially we were looking at maps which were more linear, which did not really incorporate text, because we had an audience which could not read, but which could understand visual representations of temples through their domes or shikharas. So they were in manuscript form, and the annotation was made in such a way that people could understand it. And then when at this point in time where we're looking at the Kashi Darpan, we have higher literacy, so these maps could then they had this breeding ground to essentially be disseminated and be used. So it's a tradition which has evolved as its audience evolved as well, and has taken influences, as you mentioned, from different traditions and different intersections that were happening in Banaras at that time.
Okay, well, I think we should probably wrap up this morning's session. Thank you both for those really fascinating papers. We will take about a half-hour break and reconvene at 12:45. Okay.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you.
Well, hello, welcome back to the Impressions of Empire Symposium. I hope you all had a bit of a break for lunch. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our next speaker, Michael Hartman. Michael is the Jonathan L. Cohen Associate Professor of American Art at the Hood Museum of Art, Dartmouth College. His co-edited volume, Re-envisioning Histories of American Art, has just been published with the University of Washington. His 2024 dissertation in art history at the University of Delaware, which was entitled Art, Technology, and Aesthetics Within Landscapes of Enslavement in Maryland and Virginia, 1730 to 1826, reflects his desire to critically reframe and redefine approaches to art made in North America. He's held previous curatorial positions at the Clark Institute and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. So Michael, over to you. Great. Would you like to share your screen with us?
Okay, can you see my screen? That's always the right question to ask at the beginning. Before I begin, I just want to offer my thanks to the organizers of this event, but most especially Dr. Irene Brooke and Bianca Arthur Hull for all of their work. I also want to offer my thanks to yesterday's and today's presenters, even though I had a technical difficulty this morning and was unable to join, but thankfully Bianca got me sorted out during the break. So I'll just jump right in. I know that I'm here to talk about prints today, but please bear with me as we begin with a painting that is probably familiar to many of you to ground us in a specific time and place. Benjamin West's The Death of General Wolfe is often hailed as one of the most important paintings of the 18th century. The large canvas portrays Wolfe's valiant death in Quebec at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, which marked a turning point in the Seven Years' War and eventually led to France's surrender of Quebec to the British. This international and global conflict included various European, colonial, and indigenous nations, pitting colonists and their allies against one another. But the success gave Britain its largest North American empire until the American Revolution took part of that away later in the century. In this memorial painting made in London, Wolfe is portrayed as a martyr. Painting him like Christ with the flag raised as a symbol of imperial expansion standing in for the cross. West's painting transfixed British audiences and ushered in a new artistic mode of representing history by placing the figures within contemporary dress rather than portraying them in fashions derived from antiquity. Many people in West's painting can be identified. This includes Herbie Smith, who created the last lifetime sketch of General Wolfe, as well as British Indian agent to the Haudenosaunee William Johnson at the far left in the green coat. However, we do not know the identity of everyone in this painting, including the Mohawk man seated on the ground. Unlike other individuals, he is portrayed partially unclothed and in the guise of the Belvedere torso, thus emphasizing his muscular body and quote-unquote natural beauty to situate this figure within the racist ideological framework of the noble savage. Even so, West took a painstaking approach to this figure. He used his personal collection of Six Nations arts, weaponry, and material culture to paint the man's shoulder bag and the tomahawk according to life, thus instilling a sense of truth into the scene. While West's painting relies on racist tropes, it nonetheless portrays individuals of different nations that allied together against the French in the Seven Years' War. Today, this painting is considered the painting of the conflict. However, it debuted in 1770, more than a decade after Wolfe's death in 1759. The reproductive print, made in London by William Woollett, only became available in 1776, a year in which trade between Britain and its American colonies wasn't exactly on the best of terms. Between 1759 and 1776, portrait prints like this one by Robert Sayer appeared on the market to commemorate the battle and Britain's further expansion into Canada. Unlike West's painting, Wolfe is not portrayed on the precipice of death or as a martyr. He stands triumphantly in front of the battle unfolding behind him, becoming the sole focus without any other identifiable figures. Sayer's print circulated throughout Britain's expansive empire and focused on Wolfe's success rather than his death. It appeared on the market much earlier than reproductive prints made after West's multi-figure composition. It was far more affordable than the multi-figure historical print, and it also reached far more people in print than in the original painted portrait. Sayer's portrait print of General Wolfe commemorated British colonial expansion and functioned as the image of the conflict for about a decade before West's now more famous image became available. I'm currently in the early stages of a larger project that looks at how portrait prints portraying military or political figures function as memorials. They aided in the formation of white masculinity, and they visualized empire through the bodies of white men in mid-18th century North America. Today, I will focus on collecting practices specifically in the North American colonies to explore how these relatively overlooked portrait prints contributed to the formation of imperial ambition by locating settler colonialist expansion ideologies within the printed and circulated bodies of white men rather than within representations of the land itself. Doing so extends beyond the original painted portrait to reveal how these engraved portraits fostered an interchangeability of bodies and land which were doing the visual work of empire formation. So, in the 19th century, within the field of US art history, we often interpret landscape paintings as visual arguments for manifest destiny, or the concept that the settler colonial nation of the United States had a God-given right to settle the entire North American continent. 19th century American landscapes, whether by the British-born painter Thomas Cole or the German-American Albert Bierstadt, portrayed empty landscapes devoid of indigenous people who had lived on and cared for these lands for millennia and continue to do so today. These artists perpetuated the mythology of the untouched and uninhabited landscape, open for settler colonization, as several scholars have demonstrated, especially within Britain's former colonies. In his study of Australia, for instance, anthropologist Patrick Wolfe argues that settler colonialism is direct invasion against indigenous nations that operates on the concept of an empty land. Colonizers manufactured this false understanding to develop complex narratives that erased indigenous peoples' humanity, as well as their kin and social networks. That erasure is quite clear in landscapes made in Britain's former North American colony, where indigenous people are largely absent from representation. In the mid-18th century, however, such a rhetoric of landscape had not fully developed, and there are very few representations of North American landscapes until the final quarter of the 18th century. How then did British artists and their patrons envision empire before this moment? Rather than considering absence, I'm interested in who is present in these mezzotints and why. In this earlier moment, artists portrayed the men whose militarized actions aided in conquering colonized lands from European and indigenous nations in North America, as well as securing broader dominance over the French. These works, I contend, could function similarly to how we interpret landscape paintings made in the late 18th and into the 19th centuries. Like the empty landscape, mezzotints can be visually seductive. Their velvety surface is created by using a rocker to rough up the plate. Doing so creates tiny burrs that lift from the copper surface, which hold the ink when printed. To create tonal varieties, the printmaker leaves more burrs, which darken the print. The printmaker grounds down areas that are to be printed lighter, sometimes adding an engraved line around the edges of details to make them stand out from the rest of the scene. The tonal range of a black and white mezzotint more closely approximates portrait painting in comparison to traditional line engraving. The mezzotint's ability to render the tonalities of skin tone or the variances between fabrics and portraits aided in its rise in popularity across the British Empire in the 18th century, including in North America, where a focus on individual achievement and personhood is more often superseded in comparison to some of the more religious functions of art elsewhere on the continent. Artists printed and circulated the bodies of white men who used from left to right their telescopes, guns, swords, papers, or batons to secure British imperial interests. These prints portrayed people who wielded symbols of power and expansion, and American colonists eagerly purchased these works to decorate their homes. On this slide, for example, you can see excerpts from the 1800 estate inventory of Massachusetts resident Esther Williams. On the left, we find a group of the 4 prints that I just showed you, listed as engravings: General Wolfe, William Pitt, General Blakeney, and Admiral Hawke. Esther Williams' husband, Dr. Thomas Williams, was a surgeon with the British Army during the Seven Years' War. Elsewhere in this inventory, we find additional prints, notably one of the King of Prussia, another major actor in the Seven Years' War, alongside maps used by colonists and military men to visualize the landscape. Now, because the prints in the Williams inventory relate to the Seven Years' War, we can assume that this collection was assembled to represent this event. Furthermore, representations of the conflict in the 1760 were just not as available immediately in the colonies as representations of the battle, for instance. But instead, we see these portrait prints begin to circulate, which could stand in for the broader event and place. Portrait prints are often approached through the lens of biography of the original sitters, which is important if we are to understand the sitters' connection to the Seven Years' War. However, I'd like to think about how people viewed and understood these prints within a relatively rural Massachusetts house, and how this might extend to how more North American colonists collected and interacted with mezzotints in this period. Scholarship in U.S. and British colonial art history often describes how imported mezzotints served as prototypes for portrait painters in the colonies, rather than how they might have been displayed and understood. Perhaps the most notable example is Boston's painter John Singleton Copley, who regularly posed wealthy Bostonians like Mary Sherburne Bowers in the guise of imported British prints, in this case, Lady Caroline Russell, recently discussed by art historian Caroline Culp. Outside of such comparisons, portrait mezzotint collecting and reception in the 18th century British colonies is relatively understudied. We instead give preference to paintings and, to a lesser degree, sculpture. We know, for instance, that Virginian William Byrd amassed one of the largest collections of painted portraits in the colonies during the second quarter of the 18th century at his Westover plantation in Virginia. You can see many of them here on the screen thanks to Janine Bolt's Colonial Virginia Portraits project. Similarly, studies abound on collections of painted portraits amassed during the early national period, such as Thomas Jefferson's at Monticello. The problem in studying portrait prints, at least within the North American context, is that most estate inventories do not list the name of the person portrayed unless they were particularly well known, such as General Wolfe. And in the case of the Williams inventory, where people are named, we do not actually know the exact edition of the prints that were owned, which limits the application of the art historical method of visual analysis. What we do know, however, is that Dr. Thomas Williams likely collected his portrait prints during and after the conflict in the 1760s as aids to memory, a means to recall his time serving in the war. Looking at this specific grouping, however, begs the question: what do we learn when we think about these prints as portable memorials that could be present in multiple houses throughout the colonies? As art historian Joan Cotu argues in her book on British monuments, few mid-18th century American colonists actually visualized empire through the body of the king. Instead of portraying the king, monuments that were erected in this period in Britain's North American and Caribbean colonies were just as likely to commemorate kings as commoners, such as General Wolfe or William Pitt, which you can see here. Cotu argues that sculptures in Britain and its colonies actively aided in the visual construction of empire, with the appearance of each taking up public space to make a statement about Britain's increasing expansion. These sculptures promoted the ongoing development and flux of imperial ambition, rather than reflecting an empire fully established. This was especially true at the time of the Seven Years' War, where the full extent of Britain's project in the North American colonies remained uncertain. Statues provided one means of tying the construction of empire to individuals who promoted imperial expansion. So, for instance, when Charlestonians selected a statue for their city, they commissioned sculptor Joseph Wilton for a full length of William Pitt, who was dressed in a toga and reflected the older mode of commemorative artwork. As the first public sculpture in Charleston, South Carolina, this work notably portrayed a British politician and not someone born in the colonies. Many colonists attributed British success in the Seven Years' War to Pitt's leadership and advocacy for British victory over France at any cost. As art historian Wendy Bellion argues, when this sculpture was installed at the heart of Charleston's urban landscape, it served a commemorative function, but it also became part of a broader system of surveillance. Standing near the slave market at a major crossroads in a city with a majority enslaved Black populace, the white marble functioned as, to quote Bellion, a spectacle of whiteness reflecting the racial politics of elite Charlestonians. End quote. Taking these ideas about whiteness and surveillance and rethinking them through the medium of mezzotint pushes us to further consider how prints constructed similar meaning in the 18th century when purchased and displayed in the homes of middling and upper-class British colonists. When the public body entered the private house, such as that of the Williams household in Deerfield, it served a similar function in print. Images of Pitt, Wolfe, and others surrounded all who entered the house, whether it was the owners themselves, their children, the unnamed enslaved woman who resided there, or other residents and visitors who would have included Indigenous Americans. Depending upon the viewer's race or politics, these works could be seen as celebratory, oppressive, or violent, due to the inherent violence rooted within enslavement and settler colonialism. Thus, through the collecting and installation of prints, the home became a microcosm of the larger town square, where these prints asked for the viewer's fealty to the formation of empire. Each individual symbolized imperial expansion. Edward Hawke fought in the Mediterranean during the Seven Years' War, Wolfe in Canada. Pitt advocated in Parliament, and General Blakeney served as Lieutenant Governor of Minorca, Britain's key trading post in the Mediterranean that was lost by the end of the war. The mezzotint of General Wolfe that was likely on display in the Williams household and many others throughout the colonies was made by Roger Sayer and reproduces a painting by J.S.C. Schock, which derived from an original sketch by Hervey Smith. So you can see multiple translations occurring here. Smith was one of the figures standing above General Wolfe in West's painting, and his sketch is likely the last known lifetime image of Wolfe. Its linear qualities, devoid of shading or tonality, suggest that Smith was trained as a military draftsman who created maps, sketches, and plans for battle, rather than receiving more formal training as a practicing artist. The bottom of Sayer's print stated that the mezzotint was created from an original picture in the possession of Hervey Smith, thus offering its purchaser an element of truth and representation, because the print derived from the last known image of General Wolfe. Emphasizing that this print derived from a real sketch securely situated this mezzotint as a type of memorial. The sketch was likely also used by Joseph Wilton in creating the monument to General Wolfe at Westminster. Wilton originally attempted to make a cast from Wolfe's face, but as you can imagine, after having his body transported back across the Atlantic, Wilton was unable to create a suitable cast from the corpse. Without the life cast, Smith's sketch still offered truth to the viewer. Colonists could likewise collect the man in print as a way to memorialize his sacrifice for the nation's continued imperial expansion. Assembling a group of mezzotins in his Deerfield home, which were promised to be made from life, Dr. Thomas Williams fashioned a pantheon of individuals that promoted Britain's imperial power on a global scale within the confines of his rural home in the Massachusetts colony. Portraits of white military men and politicians do not just celebrate empire or commemorate loss, they also, I would argue, bring empire into being. An image of the battle was not needed to commemorate the war. A landscape was not required to falsely imagine an empty landscape that was in reality heavily populated. The individual can become the stand-in for imperial expansion, imagined domination, and colonization. Now, I would like to pivot just for a moment and speculate. A notable absence in this memorialization and imperial formation project in the Williams inventory and others in North America before 1775 is Elizabeth Bakewell's print after an original painting by Pennsylvania colonist William Williams portraying Hendrik Teanaguen. Teanaguen was a Mohawk leader born around 1691 who sat for his portrait by William Williams in Philadelphia in 1754 or 1755. That painting, now lost or unlocated, was likely the source for Bakewell's print issued after his death at the Battle of Lake George during the Seven Years' War, where Deerfield's own Dr. Thomas Williams served as a surgeon. Thomas Williams' brother, Ephraim Williams, whose estate established what is today Williams College, died on the same battlefield as Teanaguen, and it is likely that all three knew one another. Teanaguen, like many indigenous people of his time, adopted British attire when entering into British spaces, and the same can be said of colonial officials who often wore indigenous regalia when engaging indigenous leaders in their own nations. He likely holds wampum beads that represent the Covenant Chain, which were a series of alliances and treaties first developed between the Haudenosaunee and the British in the 17th century. In 1753, however, Teanaguen asserted that the chain had been broken, and after being cheated out of their lands in the War. From there, The Albany Congress, which brought together colonial delegates from Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island to pursue a treaty with the Mohawk Nation and other Iroquois tribes. The colonists and Britain knew that they needed the support of the Mohawk and allied nations to win a colonial war against the French. William Johnson, who appears in West painting at the far left, successfully aided in the renegotiation with Teanaguen. Both Ephraim Williams and Dr. Thomas Williams also attended the Albany Congress. Teanaguen's military success in aiding the British while advocating for his own national interests appeared in colonial and mainland British newspapers, yet no print of him has provenance to the British colonies, even though colonists like Ephraim and Thomas Williams likely knew him from treaty negotiations and the battlefield. In many ways, it would seem that British collectors in London needed a print of Teanaguen in the same way that colonists sought images of British military men and politicians. For Teanaguen's print in a London household, he was a Mohawk leader without whom the British conquering of Quebec would not have been possible. This aligns with Troy Bickham's argument that from the 1750s through the American Revolution, it was the power of Native Americans and not their supposed exoticism that placed them at the forefront of the British imagination, although certainly both of these aspects are at play. Such prints reveal the entanglements in trade, politics, and economics, as well as militarism, in the mid-18th century that begin to fall apart and adhere more closely to the stereotypes that we see in later historical scenes, such as with the circulation of West print of the death of General Wolfe and the inclusion of a generalized Mohawk individual. The absence of this print in the Williams household and the broader colonial sphere speaks to the reification of white masculinity that was less at the close of the Seven Years' War, and would fuel the American Revolutionary moment and founding the United States well into the 19th century. Now, the strength of empire visualized elsewhere, but also within intimate print installations that emphasize the bodies of white men as a visualization of imperial expansion in an era before landscape had fully developed. As art historian Kirsten Pye Buick and others have argued, we need to name the overwhelming presence of whiteness in addition to thinking about who is absent from these sorts of installations, because prints like these in the Williams household reified the perception of an imperial construction absent the contributions of indigenous, Black, and other people of color within the North American colonies in this period. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was extremely interesting. I have some comments that I'll make later. Okay, so now we have Catherine Dossin. So Catherine is Associate Professor of Art History at Purdue University. She's the author of The Rise and Fall of American Art, 1940s to 1980s, A Geopolitics of Western Art Worlds, the co-editor with DaCosta Kaufman and Joyeux Prunelle of Circulations in the Global History of Art, the co-author with Bolland of Louise Blair Daura, a Virginian in Paris, and the editor of France and the Visual Arts since 1945. She's finishing a book project on French images of America in the Age of Revolution, the global and visual history of a colonial mirage. So thank you very much, Catherine. Over to you.
Thank you to you, and thank you for organizing the conference and allowing us to participate even remotely, because it has been great for the past 2 days. It would have been even better to be in person, but I really appreciate the opportunity. So, 2 series of 18th century prints depict French national and colonial harbors. The first, Vue des Ports de France, was created by Jean-Philippe Lebas and Charles-Nicolas Cochin after paintings by Joseph Vernet. The second, Nouvelle Vue Perspective des Ports de France, was engraved by Yves-Marie Legoise and Marie-Françoise Ozanne, based on drawing by Nicolas Ozanne. While the original paintings and drawings have attracted significant scholarly interest due to their status as royal commissions, their interpretive prints have often been overlooked, dismissed as mere reproduction, despite their commercial success and widespread circulation. So in the context of a conference examining the significance of works on paper during the era of global empire and colonization, I would like to explore how the printed interpretations of Vue des Ports de France and Nouvelle Vue Perspective served as essential and powerful instrument for disseminating the messages embedded in the originals. So first, I will argue that the prints were integral components of the royal commissions and should be regarded alongside the originals and exhibition history as one whole project. Next, I will explore how both series help construct a new image of France that navigated the tension between French traditional agrarian values and the new colonial and commercial imperatives. Finally, we will examine the silences within these works, particularly in relation to the realities of colonial trade and imperial expansion. So to stay within my time limit, I am going to go quite fast. So don't hesitate to ask me in the Q&A if you want more detail on those parts. So, in 1753, after a royal inspection of Le Havre, Louis XV commissioned Joseph Vernet to produce 24 views of France harbor at the recommendation of the Marquis de Marigny, who was Madame de Pompadour's brother and Surintendant des Bâtiments du Roi. This ambitious project, which consumed 20% of the bâtiments budget over a decade, was closely followed and overseen by both the king and Marigny. The aim was twofold. First, to provide an accurate, up-to-date record of France's maritime infrastructure and to showcase its naval power. So a blend of data gathering and propaganda. The paintings were indeed intended to reach a broad and diverse audience. They first were presented in Versailles, then exhibited at the Salon, where their royal commission drew significant attention, before being sent to the newly opened Luxembourg Museum for continued public display. And finally, they were aged by Lebas and Cochin. So the print series origins are often linked to a 1755 Salon review suggesting that Vernet's painting should be engraved. But to me, the idea must have predated this, since at the time, major artwork were typically translated into print to reach a broader audience. Moreover, Cochin, who was present when Marigny first met Vernet in Rome, was involved in the conception of the project. As for Lebas, he had created engraving of Louis XV's 1749 visit to Le Havre, which were presented to the king in 1753, the very same year he commissioned Vernet to paint the other harbors of France. So all this to me indicate that the prints were always part of the project, and evidence, not an afterthought. In 758, after the Salon showing of Vernet's first 8 paintings, Cochin and Lebas launched a subscription with a prospectus announcing 40 prints, more than the 24 painting commission, signaling plans to expand the series into print. Though the Crown avoided direct involvement in this commercial venture, Marigny's team facilitated it by lending the paintings, while the royal seal and caption affirming on the king's ownership of the originals gave the print official prestige. In 1767, Vernet, having completed 15 paintings of the 24, stopped. So while France defeat in the 7 Years' War that we just discussed in 1763 may have influenced his decision because there was no more boat to paint, but, I think that, the success of the print may have played a role in convincing him he did not need to finish the series and could profit from selling the print and related studio work. Marigny did not object, as the project was indeed continuing through the prints at no cost for the Crown. So, to complete the set, Cochin produced views of Brest and Le Havre in Vernet style, otherwise the cost would not have been completed. So just as Cochin and Le Bas prints were essential to the Vue des Ports de France, the etching of, no, sorry. Oh, I'm going, okay, now I'm going, okay, this is, sorry. So in the same way, the etching by Le Goise and Marie-Françoise Ozanne were central to Nouvelle Vue Perspective des Ports de France, commissioned by Louis XVI in 1775. So passionate about geography and the Navy, though he would not see the sea until his 1786 visit to Cherbourg, the king sought updated views of French harbors. Ozanne, who had supervised the maritime education of the royal brother and accompanied Vernet to his travel between 1756 and 1757, was a natural choice. So like Vernet's painting, his drawing were to document France's harbors and promote awareness of maritime commerce and port infrastructure. So in 1776, Ozanne produced 60 large wash drawings, likely based in part on earlier sketch from his time with Vernet. As a naval engineer, rather than a salon artist, this work like maybe Vernet's artistic breadth, but offer very precise depiction of ships and port life. And covering all the major ports from Dunkirk to Antibes, they also convey the scale of France's coastline more effectively. So the drawings were etched by Ozanne's former pupil and brother-in-law, Yves-Marie Le Goise, and sold in black and white and in color. With Ozanne family's ties to the print trade, etching and distribution of the drawing were likely planned from the outset. And like the Vue des Ports de France, the project enjoyed the explicit support of the Crown, with each print bearing a royal seal and a caption noting that the original had been commissioned by the king. Over time, the Nouvelle Vue Perspective prints also took a life of their own, with the addition of a map that helped reader locate all the port, and the inclusion in 1785 of 8 views of American colonies engraved by Jeanne-Françoise Ozanne. As the caption of the new series suggests, by then, the prints were also well known that the Royal Commission no longer needed to be mentioned through the seal of the king, still show the royal endorsement. So Vue des Ports de France and Nouvelle Vue Perspective are rarely examined together, mainly because one was a prestigious salon painting series, while the other was a series of naval drawing. Yet, if we consider them through their interpretive print, their close relationship emerge along with their shared message they were designed to convey. So Vue des Ports de France and Nouvelle Vue Perspective were indeed entrusted with reshaping France's identity to include its expansive coastline and dynamic maritime commerce. Traditionally seen as a land-focused agrarian nation, France had little naval tradition. But by the 18th century, long-distance trade had become central to its economic and geopolitical ambitions. So a 1762 Navy document captured this shift. France will never be powerful, feared, or respected if it does not rule the sea. So while the Crown worked to bolster the Navy and compete commercially or militarily with England, there was also a need to change how France perceived itself, challenging the notion that maritime trade was incompatible with agriculture and promoting a vision of both as complementary forces driving national prosperity. So the first step in integrating international maritime commerce into France's identity was to counter the widespread 18th century view of the sea as a dark and dangerous place. So Vernet and Ozanne did not try to romanticize the open sea. Instead, they separated maritime commerce from its peril, centering their works on harbor and lively urban waterfronts. In their work, the sea is often pushed to the background, hidden by bustling activities. And even in offshore views, the shoreline remains reassuringly close. So Vernet had been requested to vary the times of the day and atmospheric condition in each painting, though violent storms were discouraged. Challenge for an artist known for his dramatic shipwreck. So for Set, it shows a stormy sea view, prompting objection from Marini, and they had a lot of exchanges about this. So ultimately, Vernet kept the storm, though he limited it to boats struggling against the rough weather, avoiding shipwreck imagery to maintain a positive tone. So what is interesting is that 20 years later, Ozanne recreated the scene under sunny skies and calm water. So the second step in improving the image of maritime and colonial trade involved showcasing its positive impact on the French economy and the livelihood of its people. In Vue des Ports de France and Nouvelle Vue Perspective, the city depicted are beautiful and lively. This is particularly true of Vernet's views of Bordeaux. The city, which had always been important through its wine export, became the most important French harbor due to its trade with the West Indies. The city enriched, grew, and adorned itself with beautiful modern buildings throughout the century. So in Vue de Bordeaux prise du côté des Salnières, Vernet shows the city's beautiful stone facade along the Dordogne. Yet it is the baker's stand behind the merchant unloading the barrel where customers from all classes buy fresh loaves that truly convey how commercial wealth reach all levels of society. Ozanne compositions likewise showcase the positive impact of maritime commerce through lively vignettes featuring workers, passerbys, and always 3 or 4 elegant women who embody wealth generated by maritime activities. These women are particularly striking in the color version of the print where the bright hues of their fashionable dress dominate and punctuate the composition. And this is especially true of the Vue du Port de Nantes taken from the Ile de Feydeau, which does not display the port and its bustling activity, but depict elegant women that emerge from their gilded carriage or done in beautiful dress and elaborate hairstyle. Working at a time when the physiocrats and their emphasis on agriculture were gaining prominence, Ozanne infuses drawing with rural scenes, peasant farming, hunters, and strolling couples, set against harbor and the sea. His view of Sainte-Valery-sur-Somme illustrates that agriculture and maritime commerce are complementary forces, not rivals in France's prosperity, by visually linking the farmer and animal in the foreground with a boat being constructed and the river leading to the port beyond. So, Vue des Ports de France et Nouvelle Vue Perspective aim to establish a new identity for France, positioning it as a maritime and commercial power capable of competing with England. Not surprisingly, the realities of colonial trade and the consequences of colonialism that supported this new identity are absent from Vernet and Ozanne narratives. Nevertheless, they can be inferred through the latent meanings and silences present within their composition. Upon examining this work, it becomes evident how colonial trade with the West Indies differed from other forms of long-distance commerce. For example, in this view of Marseille, there is a group of Ottoman merchants that is depicted that highlight the circulation of people and goods across the Mediterranean. In contrast, the view of Bordeaux lacks representation of foreign merchants or depiction of African slaves, although direct and triangular commerce with the West Indies was the mainstay of the city's economy. Only the little silhouette of a black nanny, I don't know if you see it here, taking care of a white child hints at the true nature of the trade powering the beautiful city. Whether Vernet included her intentionally or simply because he saw her, I mean, many Bordelais merchants brought slaves from the Antilles to serve them in France. We don't know. Still, this little figure makes the American colonies and the slave trade visible within a scene from which they are otherwise markedly absent. In 1780, Ozanne created 8 views of the American colonial ports, which were later etched by his sister Jeanne-Françoise and sold by Legoise as part of the series. Not commissioned by the Crown, this print likely responded to French rising interest in America during the War of Independence. They were most certainly inspired by drawings realized by Pierre Ozanne, who, like his older brother, was a naval painter and had participated in Vice-Admiral d'Estaing's campaign dispatched to North America in 1778. So Nicolas reinterpreted Pierre's work by shifting the focus from naval battle to peaceful scene of fishing and trade near the shore. And here is a very good example where Pierre depicted the taking over of Grenada in 1779. And Nicolas retained the same composition, but replaced the battle in the background with commercial ships and turned the column of soldiers into figures of Europeans strolling the lush setting and surveying the harbor with binocular, and on both sides, African slaves. So the Prince of Grenada, however, stand out as the sole depiction of life in the American colony from this series, which is interesting since by the time the print was published, Grenada had been returned to England and was no longer France. So the 7 views of France's American colony show anchorage from the sea, not the harbor themselves. So the object, or rather the subject of the trade, be it direct or triangular, remain once again invisible. In each, Ozanne used a consistent layout. A huge sky dominate the page with mountain in the background, boats and building marking the harbor in the middle ground, and ship with passenger in the foreground, including a few elegants with parasol, which, and this is really a rare glimpse into the reality of colonial society. But still, compared with the view of mainland French port, the representation of the American harbor appears somewhat generic, lacking not only the anecdotal details that contributed to the charm of the French series, but more importantly, lacking the economic connection between the countryside, the agriculture on the countryside, and the commerce in the harbor. There is no understanding of what is being traded. So with their generic formula, abstract trade and distance perspective, Ozanne views of Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique reflect a colonial gaze that value the island only for what their utility to France, ignoring local reality. Yet their inclusion, especially the 3 views of Saint-Domingue and Martinique, which match the major French harbor of Bordeaux and Nantes, signal that their economic importance was recognized. So there is an ambiguous portrayal of the American harbor that revealed France's uneasy relationship with this colony. So they are vital to its wealth and geopolitical importance, yet invisible and hardly included in national discourses. And that would come to play during the French Revolution, but we won't go there. So to conclude, the Vue des Ports de France and Nouvelle Vue perspective exemplify, at least for me, how works on paper were central to constructing narratives of national identity, economic power, and colonial ambition in the context of 18th century imperialism. And this is important because these 2 prints represented the most widely circulated representation of France before the Revolution, both within France and abroad. They were reproduced in various derivative forms, such as optical views, including in Germany. They were also, but I think that the most compelling evidence of their widespread distribution is the 2 series of paintings realized by Mexican painter Juan Patricio Merledo, who is after the print. And there is 2 series. So even today, this print, especially Ozanne view, continue to circulate within the art market. And this invites us to consider the enduring relevance of print, not only as historical document, but also as powerful artifact that continue to inform our nation, imagine their past, including their colonial past and place in the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for really, really excellent papers. I thought they really showed the nub why an intermedial approach is really interesting, because we saw in both cases how you start with a painting, or an absence of a painting, in some of those the images that Michael showed, and how the print then becomes the medium for distribution to a wider public and the spread of propaganda. So I mean, really, I don't have that many questions, just more comments to say how much I enjoyed the papers. I wondered, just Michael, just starting with yours. I thought it was very interesting to think, particularly after we had Chandni's paper this morning, to compare the Canadian example with the Indian example, because slightly different context, but some of the work that Chandni showed, the Daniels aquatints, for example, I know well because of my old family connections with India. So it strikes me that a similar thing might have happened in India, and I don't know whether Chandni's still with us and can comment on it, or whether you know that, in the sense that in the 18th century, I think you see a lot of portraits of Indian sort of nabobs, and then it's only at the end of the 18th century, with the arrival of artists like the Daniels, that you begin to see the production of these kind of picturesque landscapes, and then they get brought back to England, and I think they're disseminated very widely. I mean, the Daniel aquatints are still regularly sold in auctions in the UK, even though many museums have got copies of them, but I don't think they show them that much. I don't think we think they're so interesting visually anymore. But I think what both of your papers showed is how interesting they are when you think about them as historical records. So I don't know whether, Michael, you want to comment on that.
Yes, I'd be happy to comment on that. Thank you. So as far as I think sort of those sorts of landscape representations, there is a desire early on in the British North American colonies to create landscape representations, but a lot of them are rather topographic, because many of the people who are making them, for instance, are trained in the Admiralty and end up in the colony somewhere and are actually making either maps or topographic views that then go back. They're not always then turned into print. So, for instance, someone that I'm thinking about is George Beck, who is relatively unknown, but works in the Admiralty, trains in the Tower of London drawing room, and then comes to the colonies right at the beginning of the American Revolution or shortly thereafter, and then is employed by George Washington and creates all of these sort of panoramic views of Virginia in these picturesque landscapes that are intended to be reproduced as print, and some of them are, but not many actually end up being made. We also have, particularly in the colonial period, this desire for similar port views. That's what I was thinking about as I was looking at the other paper, right? That colonists, particularly those who are wealthy in Charleston, Philadelphia, Boston, want these port views, and some of them are actually sketched and sent back to London and produced as multi-plate prints that are like 7 feet long, that then come back to the colonies. And it's the immense scale of those prints in comparison to what they're actually portraying, because these cities are relatively small by comparison to other places, right? There's something interesting there about the scale of the print standing in for sort of that outsized importance of some of these ports. And it's really not until, I would say, the final quarter of the 18th century that you see landscape really take off in the colonies and then the early United States. And it's primarily from artists who are trained somehow in Britain. Oh, you're muted.
I think rather than say anything more about Catherine's paper, which I thought again was wonderful, let me open the floor to everybody else, because I'm sure other people have questions they'd like to ask.
May I ask a question to Michael?
Of course.
First, I need to send you the way it was used in France after the War of Independence, the print of wolf. I think it would amuse you, because then it's flip again. But I was wondering, like, do you find that there is a certain like formula for those portraits? I mean, the wolf is very different, but the other, they seem to all have a certain or is it like there is not a composition? Like, I was just interested in there was like a formula that when you look at a lot of them, you can say, oh, they all do this in the background, this and that.
Yeah, yeah, there's absolutely a formula to many of these works. Um, the one of Wolf is quite different. The artist who made the original painting just didn't have the same level of training as the other artists who made the original paintings for the other prints. Um, so there, I think that is where you see the difference in the Wolf print, that there is this question of how do you represent someone who is no longer living, whereas the other three sitters were still living when those were made. And then how do you locate him in a place where the painter had probably never been? So you have that, you have this disjunction of trying to, I think, create a space that is a little bit unknowable. You have the high cliff in the background, which represents Quebec City, and you have people presumably falling off the cliff behind. So Wolf is actually then not at all a part of the action. He's standing far away, even though that wasn't necessarily true. So that one, I think, stands apart from the other form. It stands apart from what I would call more formulaic portraits, where you have someone seated inside, or you have the landscape background behind them. You have maybe a curtain and a few objects that are on a table. There's only so many ways that you can pose, whether that's, with your hand on your hip or your arm on a table or something like that. So there is absolutely a formula to those works, and then it's those mezzotints that then end up in the hands of colonial British painters that then are used as inspiration then for portraits that are made in the colonies. And that's where the majority of scholarship has actually been, is looking at prints as prototypes for then portraits that are made of other individuals. And I'm just looking for a way to think about, okay, well, these were collected by individuals and they hung in their home. So what did that mean, rather than just the artist kind of using them as inspiration?
Can I ask you just on your final point there? I have no sense of the scale of these works. But so in terms of display, can you say a little bit more about, because, often prints in an earlier period were collected in albums. And so were these on wall? I mean, do inventories make that clear, or
Our understanding for most of these is that they would have hung on the walls. It would have been probably a local frame created by someone and then hung on the wall somehow. There are much, and that would be much more for sort of a middling, maybe upper class household. The more super elite households, you would then be collecting them and putting into albums, which would be the same way. So like someone like Thomas Jefferson, for instance, I mentioned, he's going to put all of his prints in albums. He'll put some of them on the walls that are important, but not to the same degree.
And did you say that they were accompanied with biographies often, or is it just the inscription at the bottom?
Just the inscription at the bottom. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. They sort of evoked in my mind this kind of printed collections of Womany Illustri in sort of later periods, And I thought it was really interesting also the kind of the different images being produced for the British market versus the colonial market, that the sort of the I don't know, maybe the exoticism of Tiana Gwyn, that appealed more to a British market than in the American market.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Bianca, yeah.
Hello. Well, I thought those papers were really fantastic, genuinely, like really, really interesting. I had a question sort of related to what both of you have already spoke about this sense of kind of safety achieved by the aesthetic qualities of these works. And whether that be sort of like the sort of portrait of these individuals within kind of these wider kind of ideas of national creation, or like these safe harbors, for example. And I don't know that much about the 18th century, but I was wondering if you could speak, both of you, a little bit about that kind of negotiation of the aesthetic appeal of the works within the kind of wider context of 18th century artistic culture, and also this desire to, use these things as propaganda and as a kind of myth making and nation building.
Okay. I have to admit that my connection was unstable, so I did not hear the beginning of your presentation. So, Michael, can you start?
Yes. So your question was just putting these more in the broader context of like art appreciation and production. Was that kind of what we're?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
like what I was really interested in is, that kind of the obviously like the desire for these artworks to fulfill like a national, like a role in creating like a sense of nationhood and that sort of more like propaganda side of things, but also the actual aesthetic qualities of the works are delicate and quite safe feeling and quite beautiful. And I was just like how do those things feed into each other? So it's a bit of a broad question, but just something that struck me.
Yeah. So do you want to go, Catherine, or do you?
I mean, like I can simply say because the salon painting, they were like everybody really liked them. They were not regarded as dramatic and beautiful as is shipwreck, but they were considered as very successful. I mean, I think to me, maybe it's going to be a silly answer, but the propaganda was it was like we are just showing how amazing it is. So they were convinced that it was great. The only thing is that, yes, it started and then the 7-Year War start. So it's not exactly a good time. And the king instructed Vernet to continue depicting eau de porte as if it was in peacetime. There is a few anecdotes, a joke that said that at some point Louis XV was told at the end of the war, well, you don't have a navy anymore. And his response was, what about Vernet? And I love this because it showed that those painting and those print, because the print circulated, were really playing the role of like the image of what we would love to see. Maybe not what is there, but an empowering vision. So we say propaganda, but maybe it would be more saying like a goal, like an image with everything positive. You could say that also. I mean, at the time when Ozan is doing his work is really the time when they are starting to support the American insurgent discreetly. So it's the secret. So 55, 56. And this is a time when they are investing in the Navy a lot. So certainly there were not that many boats in the harbor. So it's an idealized vision of what could be. So I think propaganda, it's more like an idealized vision, which then fit perfectly with 18th century vision. So that would be my little answer to your question, but they were well received at the Salon for their aesthetic quality. And I think it was not necessarily propaganda, but more positive, empowering view of what France is going to be finally if the British stop destroying our navy each time.
Yeah, and I'll build on that because I think similar things are happening in the prints that I'm talking about. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily produced specifically for the case of propaganda, but I think I think it's the way in thinking about how these would have been distributed and installed and perceived that maybe aligns them with that, right? What I am fully lacking at this point in my own research is someone walking into a house and writing down, "Wow, I saw these prints and thought this," right? That may show up and it may not, right? But I think the way that we see these happening in multiple houses, and in some very specific instances, we have provenance of some of these prints back to the original owner, which is really great and incredibly rare, as many print scholars would know, especially with these type of mezzotint portraits. But I think that the aesthetics of these, right, they're incredibly seductive because the majority of printed images that especially colonists would be encountering were engravings to some degree, right? Maybe etchings, illustrations perhaps in books. Whenever you see a mezzotint, it is just such the surface of it is just so beautiful and you see all these gradations in color, and I think that there's something inherently, I think I used the word seductive, and I think that that's still the right word to use whenever you see those, and then think about how different that would be from other things that you could potentially purchase or have in your home. And then, of course, because these are the latest and greatest things that are arriving, that's then informing the latest fashions that then are happening in the colonies and that sort of thing. So you see that build out from these sorts of images that circulate. And of course, due to the distance, right, the British colonies in fashion are always a few years behind what's happening in London, which is kind of comical. And you have portrait painters in the colonies who, such as Copley, who send something to London to be on view in the Academy exhibition. And by the time he hears the review, the of what people had to say, he's already sent the next year's painting, right? So he has no idea what is actually happening, and he's a few years behind. And it's incredibly frustrating. So we hear that too from especially artists who are involved in these networks. I would like to ask a question to Catherine. At the end, you mentioned that these series were being translated and reproduced in other countries. Can you speak more to just their broad reach? Because I find that really fascinating.
So I know they were done, and it's the print. It's not the painting, the drawing. So it's also interesting. So you see all those optical views. There is plenty. Some are written in German and French. So they clearly travel, but the most interesting is indeed the series by the Mexican artist. So it's LACMA bought a series. There is two series of painting. One is in Malta and the other was acquired by the LACMA Museum. So they restore them. So if you go on their website, you can find a few things. It's fascinating. Also in terms of translation of color, because they don't really know from whom he got the print, but there were several people in Mexico City who had the print, which shows how, and the first print were expensive. I mean, those were the prospectus. It's like, it was not like cheap print. The Ozan series is much cheaper. So that's where it's really graduated. And he made two painting series very quickly, which is amazing. And he reproduced everything, including the caption. And they have a very interesting discussion on their website about the restoration of how he used the color he used, of course, color that were local, and the difference is interesting. So yes, I mean, I think that of course it's the time after the because of the pact between France and Spain, and I think it was like Spain needed France to be strong and powerful against the British, especially in New Spain, you would say. So it was really important, I think, this vision that was not just the French who needed it, but the Spanish. So yes, we are protected from the British, who have really expanded too much in North America, and they should not come back. So I think that's my understanding of why those work. I know they were apparently reproduced in ceramics, but I've not really found anything. But they are everywhere. Finding like exactly the original is impossible because there is so many reproduction. They were done also at many points. So it's like they kept on being reproduced during the Restoration, when they were also trying to build the French Navy, and needed a lot of investment. They were also reproduced for French people to know, yes, it's important. So, but it seems from all that is surviving, there must have been tons of reproduction, because you can buy on eBay today still optical views. So if you can buy them, that means that they were. So.
Anne-Marie has a question. Anne-Marie, go ahead.
Yes, thank you both for your papers. They were terrific and I learned a great deal. Michael, I have a question for you about mezzotint. During your presentation, the word seductive caught my ear, and I was curious if you could say more about the visual possibilities afforded by mezzotint. I was interested specifically in contrast between light and dark. So how might that connect to some of the material that you discussed today?
Yes, I'd be happy. So I think exactly what you're saying, mezzotints do allow this gradation of color from essentially white paper all the way to a deep, darkly printed black, right? So, often these are used, I think, more so in portrait prints than in anything else because of their ability to really show texture in many ways. You can see a silk texture. You can see something that's a little bit has more pile to it, for instance, such as a carpet. And the ability to really represent texture in a way that does not require the line to engrave or any sort of cross-hatching or anything like that, I think is what makes these more seductive. And in some ways, kind of we're looking towards photography, I think, with the introduction and use of the mezzotint, particularly for portraits, right? That we're seeing something that's moving away from the line to being quote unquote closer to what you would see, at least in black and white, right? Um, and we see mezzotint used for multi-figure compositions. We see it used for, I think, popular kind of satirical prints, but often those are a little bit more, I would say, murky because whenever you're trying to get to representing lots and lots of figures who are interacting with one another, uh, it's much harder unless you're a very, very skilled mezzotint printmaker to create all of those different figures, all of those gradations in a way that makes visual sense. So if you have a large scene, it actually, in many instances, not all, uh, looks a little bit less successful than if you were doing an engraving. So for instance, the death of General Wolfe is reproduced as an engraving, for instance. And then Americans who study with West also are sending things to London in the late 18th, early 19th century to be turned specifically into an engraving if it's a more historical scene than a portrait. So that, at least within sort of the North American context, I think is what is happening. We do have early mezzotints that are actually made in Boston by Copley's stepfather that are quite successful. They're a little bit boring. They're mostly Puritan ministers. So you can kind of imagine it's not the same sort of quote unquote seductive quality as far as maybe seeing sumptuous fabrics and various textures of glass or wood or something like that. Um, does that answer your question? Okay.
Well, I just had a quick look at the chat and I couldn't see any more questions. I'll look once more. There are no open questions. So I guess if anybody, unless anyone else has a question to ask, we could have a break now. And we have 35 minutes. Wow. And because I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves in case people are joining for a particular talk. So I think we should stick to the schedule if that's all right with you. So we will see you at 2:30 London time, whatever time that is, wherever you are. And look forward to Anne-Marie, who's going to speak to us then. Okay. All right. See you later. Bye.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our symposium, Impressions of Empire, Works on Paper as Agents of Intermedial Translation and Cultural Exchange. I'm Bianca, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our third and final session of the symposium this afternoon, beginning with our speaker, Anne-Marie Eicher. So Anne-Marie is a scholar of modern European art, specializing in artists, artworks, and art institutions in late 19th and early 20th century Spain. She is a lecturer in the writing program at Princeton University, where she earned her PhD in art and archaeology in 2024. At present, she is adapting her doctoral dissertation on the form and function of secrecy in Catalan modernism into a book manuscript. Her recent publications include Pablo Picasso, Boy Leading a Horse, and Un secret de Polichinelle, Les quatre gars et le modernisme catalan, testing my French there. Thank you so much. Anne-Marie, take it away when you are ready.
First, I will ask, can you see my screen? Oh, great. And can you hear me? Yes, ready to go. Thank you very much. I am delighted to join you all, though I wish I were in London. First, my sincere thanks to Dr. Bruck and Dr. Jennings for organizing Impressions of Empire, to Bianca for coordinating, and to the Colnaghi Foundation and the Athena Art Foundation for hosting. It's been a pleasure to share in 2 days of conversation about works on paper in relation to colonialism and imperialism. My own presentation, titled Cuba and Catalan Modernisme, examines these two forms of exerting power over people and places through several artworks that depict a military conflict between Cuba and Spain. More about this conflict in the minutes ahead. Let me begin instead with Catalan Modernisme, the cultural movement from which these artworks emerged. Can an artwork keep a secret? The painter and art critic Josep Maria Tamburini posed this question in The Secrets of Art, an essay published in the Barcelona newspaper La Vanguardia in December 1889. According to Tamburini, secrets had thrived within the artworks and among the artists of pre-modern and early modern societies as varied as ancient Egypt and Renaissance Italy. But industrial modernity, he argues, had eliminated secrets from art. Modernity was a recurring topic in La Vanguardia, a leading newspaper in late 19th century Catalonia. Located in northeastern Spain, Catalonia was the country's most urbanized, industrialized, and cosmopolitan region. These same qualities, in Tamburini's view, had made art less secretive across Europe by the late 19th century. It was newly possible, Tamburini claims, to study the art of the past and present due to modern art museums, academies, exhibitions, publications, and criticism, like his own. In his words, I quote, "The secrets of art are no longer the property of a privileged caste responsible for transmitting them from generation to generation in written, invariable laws, guarded beneath golden covers in the mysterious subterranean rooms of the temple, as in ancient Egypt, nor are they any longer for the exclusive use of those schools founded in the warmth of the corona surrounding a master. Modernity had dislodged masters and privileged castes. Modernity had opened subterranean rooms. Modernity, in short, had revealed the secrets of art." Not everyone, however, accepted this assessment. Today, I will discuss a group of artists and writers based in and around turn-of-the-century Barcelona, whose portraits you see here. These artists and writers believed that secrecy had the potential to make art more modern, not less. Indeed, these artists and writers referred to themselves as modernistas, a Catalan language neologism that translates roughly to modernists. The cultural movement, soon known as Modernisme, transformed art, literature, architecture, design, and music in Catalonia in the years around 1900. Modernisme took many forms, some of which may be familiar to you. The poetry of Joan Maragall, the paintings of Santiago Rusiñol, the furniture of Gaspar Omar, the buildings of Antoni Gaudí, Lluís Domènech i Montaner, Josep Puig i Cadafalch. Since the turn of the 20th century, Modernisme has been understood as a quintessentially Catalan cultural movement. Today, though, I will propose that this movement was shaped in subtle but significant ways by the Spanish colony of Cuba. In the late 19th century, Cuba's economic importance to Spain was something of an open secret. At the time, Cuba was Spain's most lucrative colony, with plantations that produced much of the world's cotton, coffee, tobacco, and above all, sugar. Reliant on enslaved laborers until the 1880s, these plantations were owned and operated in many cases by Catalans. During a period of economic stagnation in Spain, Catalan painters contributed to the relative success of Catalan industry and finance, while also patronizing modernista art, literature, architecture, design, and music. In recent decades, scholars have devoted considerable attention to the many connections, economic, social, political, military, between 19th century Cuba and Catalonia. Unfortunately, though, the same cannot be said for Cuba and Catalan Modernisme. While critics and scholars of Catalan art have long emphasized the movement's ties to Europe, its ties to the Americas have been understudied. Accordingly, the aim of my current research project is to expand understandings of Catalan Modernisme to include the Caribbean island that financed, facilitated, and informed many of its creations. My focus today is a small part of this larger story, the oil painting you see here by the celebrated Modernista painter, printmaker, and illustrator Ramon Casas. Embarkation of Troops depicts a momentous episode in the history of Cuba and Catalonia, the mass departure of peninsular troops for the Caribbean island in the spring of 1895, at the outbreak of the Cuban War of Independence. Casas is believed to have begun embarkation of troops in 1896, only a few months after the events that it depicts. The artist never finished the painting, however, as is evident from its passages of exposed canvas and its visible underdrawing and underpainting. These qualities were unusual for Casas, a meticulous painter known for his carefully conceived and executed compositions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he appears to have publicly exhibited the unfinished embarkation of troops only once during his lifetime. What is surprising, then, is the history of preparatory drawings for embarkation of troops. Casas seems to have undertaken these preparatory drawings, a few of which are shown here, as figural and compositional studies for the painting. Yet the drawings, I will argue today, in many ways surpassed the painting. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, several of these drawings were reproduced in Catalan newspapers, magazines, and journals, alongside coverage of the Cuban War of Independence and its contested aftermath. Thus, the drawings participated in a vigorous collective conversation about the war, in particular, the controversial involvement of Catalan troops. So my presentation considers the ways in which paper, even more than canvas, took part in turn-of-the-century Catalan-Cuban entanglements. For Catalans living in Spain, the war with Cuba played out on paper. Catalan newspapers reported the onset of the conflict in February 1895, when Cuban revolutionaries declared independence from Spain and began to attack Spanish interests all throughout the island. At the time, though, Catalan newspapers overlooked the serious grievances of Cuban revolutionaries. Exorbitant taxes imposed by Spain, along with elevated trade deficits, inadequate infrastructure, pervasive corruption, rampant discrimination, and a glaring lack of political representation and civil liberties. Instead of a coordinated and committed anti-colonial uprising, the conflict was portrayed in the newspapers you see here as a diffuse, disorderly revolt led by angry laborers. From 1895, this revolt would be a recurring subject for the Catalan press. Throughout the period, newspapers, magazines, and journals recounted battles, profiled officers, and traced troop movements, all while describing the expansion of the revolt into an all-out war. The medium was verbal as well as visual. As you can see here, coverage of the war by the Catalan press often included graphics, both prints and photographs. Accordingly, the Cuban War not only played out on paper for Catalans in Spain, it played out in images on paper. One moment, I'm having trouble advancing the slide.
Marie, maybe just use the down arrow on your laptop. Sometimes that works.
That's what I have been using.
Have you? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the one that's actually on your keyboard rather than on the screen.
Oh, I see. Okay, let me try that.
Just try that. Nope.
Do you want to maybe try exiting the kind of full screen mode and re-entering?
I think she may have frozen.
Yes.
Yeah. That may be the problem.
Problem, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Just.
Oh,
You might be rejoining. I'll just keep
yeah.
it.
Okay. Bianca, I'll let you take over this.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh. Right, I've just sent her. Oh, there she is. Great.
Oh, I disappeared. I was logged out entirely of my computer.
Oh, no.
Let's try again.
Sure.
Take two. Okay. Fingers crossed. In 1895, many of these images depicted Catalan troops departing for Cuba. Shown here are a few examples from Catalan periodicals in the spring, summer, and fall of that year when thousands of soldiers set sail for the Caribbean. As a group, these images convey the sheer scale and complexity of mass mobilization during wartime. In them, we see the marshaling of military personnel and equipment. In addition, we see the transformation of industrial and commercial facilities into staging grounds for war. Casas, we can assume, encountered at least some of these images in Catalan periodicals. As a socially engaged artist who regularly treated contemporary events in his works, Casas was steeped in Catalan print culture of the 1890s. Indeed, he actively contributed to this print culture in a variety of ways. During the late 1880s and early 1890s, for example, he served as a regular contributing illustrator at La Vanguardia. Let's take a closer look then at La Vanguardia and its coverage of the Cuban War on March 10, 1895, just days after 2 Spanish battalions left Barcelona for Cuba. First and foremost, I will note that La Vanguardia did not refer to the conflict, at this point at least, as a war. Instead, the newspaper, in keeping with other Catalan and Spanish periodicals, referred to the conflict as a rebellion, specifically a domestic rebellion. La Vanguardia contrasts the conflict in Cuba with Spain's colonial conflicts in North Africa. In Morocco, the newspaper claims Spaniards were fighting enemies. In Cuba, meanwhile, Spaniards were fighting brothers. Casas, however, calls this claim into question an embarkation of troops. Compositional similarities between Embarkation of Troops and La Vanguardia's print suggest that Casas may have had the newspaper in mind while conceiving the painting. The print, like the painting, depicts the port of Barcelona in the midst of military activity. In both works, soldiers gather at a loading dock and ships cluster on the horizon line. Even their titles are similar. In the case of the painting, Embarkation of Troops. In the case of the print, Embarkation of Troops for Cuba. Yet differences between the print and the painting emerge upon closer inspection. Most notably, Casas collapses the foreground, middle ground, and background of the painting. While the print pictures a deep physical space that stretches from the bustling wharf in the immediate foreground to the open sea in the distant background, the painting compresses the space by filling it with a compact mass of soldiers pressed one against another, largely uninterrupted and undifferentiated. These soldiers, unlike those in the print, turn away from the viewer. We see only the backs of their heads and at most the sides of their faces. Relatedly, Casas omits the anecdotal details that pepper the print. For example, the scattered trunks and uniformed officers on the wharf, the waving soldiers in rowboats and sailboats setting out to sea. As opposed to the distinct individuals and discrete scenes of the print, the painting underscores the totalizing effect of military mobilization. Another key difference between the print and the painting is orientation. Both works are set in the port of Barcelona, where Spanish battalions began their voyages to Cuba. But the print appears to be oriented toward the east in the direction of an embankment and beyond the Mediterranean Sea. Meanwhile, the painting is oriented toward the southwest, in the direction of a mountain known as Montjuic. This mountain, visible at center right in the painting, had long served as a physical landmark in Barcelona. By the late 19th century, it was also a symbol of state repression. In previous decades, civil and military authorities in Barcelona had used the Montjuic Castle, a fortress dating to the 18th century, indicated with the red arrow, to suppress protests on the streets below. Often, these authorities were non-Catalan Spaniards, which aggravated tensions in the proudly Catalan city of Barcelona. The presence of Montjuic and embarkation of troops serves as a reminder that it was the Spanish state that controlled military strategy, operations, and tactics in Cuba. All three were widely perceived to be ineffective and unjust, particularly in Catalonia. There, large numbers of young, impoverished men were conscripted into the army and navy, then shipped to Cuba with limited training and resources. Preparatory drawings for embarkation of troops underscore this critique. Casas, in these three drawings now held at the National Museum of Catalan Art, explores the following question: how to configure commissioned officers and enlisted soldiers in relation to each other. Across the drawings, the artist returns to these two figural types. In each drawing, a single officer stands in front of and apart from a group of enlisted soldiers. These soldiers huddle together, carrying rucksacks over their shoulders. Big and bulky, the rucksacks convey the physical and figurative load of enlisted soldiers in the war. Tasked with regaining control of Cuba, these soldiers, most of them conscripts, were unprepared for what they encountered there. A guerrilla-style conflict characterized by ambushes and sabotage in a tropical environment where mosquito-borne illnesses were endemic. As suggested by Casas, the Spanish rank and file was, in a single word, overburdened. Rucksacks are not the only objects of note in embarkation of troops drawings. In all three, Casas juxtaposes the rucksacks hauled by enlisted soldiers with the small, over-the-shoulder sling bag worn by the officer. The contrast is stark. Enlisted soldiers, not officers, do the heavy lifting. Profound inequities characterized the Spanish military. Moreover, Casas, in two of the drawings, juxtaposes the officer's sword, which dangles from his hip, with the nearby guitar held by an enlisted soldier. Once again, the contrast is stark. The officer totes a weapon, while the enlisted soldier totes a musical instrument. Here, Casas associates the officer corps with aggression. On January 1st, 1897, one of the embarkation of troops preparatory drawings appeared in La Vanguardia, in a New Year's Day supplement that revisited the events of the previous year. By this point, the Catalan press coverage of the Cuban War had changed drastically. Pessimism had replaced optimism. The war increasingly was seen as a diplomatic and military failure. A primary reason for this change was the shocking number of fatalities in the Spanish military. Between 1895 and 1898, tens of thousands of soldiers died in Cuba. Remarkably, most died of preventable diseases such as yellow fever, malaria, tuberculosis, pneumonia. Thus, the greatest risk for Spanish soldiers in Cuba was not the Cuban Liberation Army. Instead, it was illness exacerbated by insufficient nourishment and medical care. In other words, by the shortcomings of the Spanish military itself. Lavanguardia's selection of embarkation of troops for its New Year's Day supplement marks a change in the course, a change in course for the newspaper. Previously, Lavanguardia had represented the Cuban War largely through portraits, in particular, bust-length portraits of high-ranking officers. Seen alongside these examples, Casas's drawing stands out in several ways. The artist shifts our attention from the individual to the collective, from the elite to the rank and file, and from the famous to the anonymous. In this respect, Casas was fulfilling a call made in March 1895 at the outset of the Cuban War. This call appeared in the Catalan periodical you see here, a satirical magazine known for its stinging critiques of the Spanish government. On page 1 of the issue is a photograph titled, once again, Embarkation of Troops for Cuba. On page 2 of the issue is a lament for these troops. Poor soldiers, writes the columnist, when will Barcelona raise a monument to the unhappy soldier, to the anonymous hero? The columnist proceeds to describe the scene pictured on the cover of the issue, the mass departure of unhappy soldiers, of anonymous heroes for Cuba. Interestingly, the columnist notes that due to equipment shortages in the military, many soldiers carried guitars rather than weapons. Bidding them farewell, the columnist observes, were their families, friends, and neighbors, the figures shown in the photograph that you see here. In Embarkation of Troops, Casas, in fact, includes several figures who resemble the civilians pictured in the photograph. By doing so, the artist gestures to the impact of the Cuban War on non-combatants, on those, in the grisly words of the columnist, who attended the funerals of combatants. Curiously, Casas does not depict civilians in his preparatory drawings, at least those at the National Museum at Colonial. This raises important questions. How are we to understand the relationship between the drawings and the painting? Why, in the end, did the painting remain unfinished? An answer of sorts can be found in the catalog shown here. This catalog accompanied a solo exhibition of works by Casas held in Barcelona in 1900, likely the sole public exhibition of Embarkation of Troops during the artist's lifetime. Yet the painting, as you can see, has a different title in the catalog. In English, it would translate to History Painting Sketched. This title, I believe, crystallizes tensions within the entire Embarkation of Troops project. Tensions between painting and drawing, tensions between history and current events. Casas, it seems, was unable to resolve these tensions to his satisfaction. What is a history painting sketched? Can a history painting be a sketch? Can a sketch be a history painting? What was the place of history painting in a media environment dominated more and more by multiples, by prints and photographs reproduced in widely circulated newspapers, magazines, and journals? For Casas, in a sense, painting was already becoming history in the years around 1900, less direct, immediate, responsive, and nimble than his works on paper. Another tension suffuses the Embarkation of Troops project, a tension that takes us back to where we began with Catalan Modernisme and secrecy. This tension is between revelation and concealment, inclusion and exclusion. How much of the Cuban War was to be shown, and shown to whom? At a time when Spanish authorities were suppressing opposition to the war, this question was not only aesthetic, it was also political. Critiques of Spanish military strategy, operations, and tactics in Cuba and beyond had serious consequences. Casas, across the work shown here, tested the boundaries of critique by showing and not showing, both in terms of the content of his art and its presentation or lack of presentation to the public. I will end here with the definition of the word secret in a Catalan language dictionary. Something unknown to the majority, which he who does know is not to divulge. The first half of this definition helps to explain the Modernista preoccupation with secrets. Was there a more attractive subject for artists or writers than that which is unknown to the majority? convinced that turn-of-the-century painters and poets were a special minority with unique insight into modern life. The modernistas believed deeply in their separateness from and their special significance to the unknowing majority. However, the second half of this definition points to a problem with which the modernistas would grapple. If artists and writers were a special minority with superior access to the unknown, how much should they make known? This problem shaped the production, display, and reception of modernista art throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, not least the embarkation of troops painting and drawings. I will end here. Thank you. I appreciate your time, attention, and patience as I logged back in.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. That was fantastic. Yes, no, completely fine about we had issues yesterday, so we're very used to it. So next up, I will be introducing our last speaker today, Asha Moveen. So thank you for joining us, Asha. Asha is a writer, an emerging curator, and third-year PhD candidate in art and visual culture at Western University. His research explores the astronomical knowledge systems of ancient and indigenous civilizations through the art and architecture, with a focus on epistemologies marginalized by Eurocentric frameworks. He is particularly interested in decolonial pedagogy and interdisciplinary methodologies. Beyond academia, he curates exhibitions and hosts Ecologies in Practice, a podcast series exploring the intersections of art, sustainability, and environmental justice. Thank you, Asha.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bianca. Just want to make sure that you can see my screen. All right, well, greetings from the land of maple syrup. I'm Usher. Thank you so much to the host and organizers for having me. It's an honor and privilege. I'll dive right in. So, palimpsests of the heavens, empire, epistemicide, and the papered sky. In the annals of empire, the night sky has often been pressed into paper service. It's been mapped, it's been diagrammed, it's been annotated to fit imperial ambitions. Celestial charts and diagrams became more than scientific records. They were instruments of power that translated the heavens into knowable, governable domains. In committing the heavens to paper, an act that was long celebrated as a triumph of reason, empires also enacted a quieter conquest, and that was the slow erasure or subsumption of older cosmologies under new grids and coordinates. And so the result becomes this epistemicide, which is a killing or occultation of knowledge systems, as storied relational cosmologies were effectively replaced by linear segmented grids of imperial astronomy. But even as imperial star maps claimed objectivity, they carried with them ghostly traces of the knowledge that they overwrote, like palimpsests, where erased cosmologies still faintly lurk behind the bold lines of imperial ink. And so my paper briefly explores two historical moments when works on paper became agents of intermedial translation and cultural exchange in the sky above. First, the star charts of the Abbasid era Islamic world, and second, the Jesuit observatory reports from King China. Now, these are separated by culture, by era, by geography, but these cases nonetheless reveal entangled processes of epistemic translation, visual abstraction, and imperial control. And so each involved knowledge crossing between worlds. You have Greek to Arabic, European to Chinese, and each shows how empire uses paper and ink to reframe the cosmos on its own terms, often at the expense of existing ways of knowing. And so in what follows, I'll journey from a 10th century Persian astronomer's illustrated manuscript in Asfahan to a 17th century Jesuit astronomer reports and charts in Beijing. And so along the way, I'll try to consider how grids and margins, Latinized constellations, and other visual techniques work to really convert the infinite sky into an object of imperial understanding. And so framing my inquiry will be decolonial theory, visual culture studies, and I'm going to try to treat those startups not as neutral artifacts, but as layered inscriptions of cosmological struggle, where each layer of ink hides as much as it reveals. And so before diving in, it's worth noting that the intermedial nature of these papers, guys, star maps and observatory reports did not exist in isolation. They intersected with architecture, with ritual, with oral tradition in all of their contexts. And an imperial star chart might guide the construction of an observatory or align the choreography of court rituals. And conversely, oral star lore and embodied practices, from navigational techniques to astrological rites, often informed or resisted what was inked on those pages. So by keeping these intersections in mind, we can better understand how works on paper functioned as nodes in a broader network of media, from manuscripts and prints to celestial globes and sealings and storytelling traditions. So in the 10th century, at the court of the Buyid dynasty in Persia, this was a realm that was under the cultural sway of the Abbasid Caliphate, by the way. There was an astronomer by the name of Abdul Rahman al-Sufi, who presents his patron with an extraordinary. In English, it's called the Book of the Images of the Fixed Stars. And this was more than a star catalog. It was a visual and intellectual palimpsest because it was layering the Hellenistic constellations of Ptolemy with the star lore of pre-Islamic Arabia. Al-Sufi, working in the imperial milieu of the Abbasid scholarly Renaissance, took Ptolemy's 48 classical constellations and expanded and updated them, integrating the very rich star lore and nomenclature of the Anwa, which is the pre-Islamic Arabic tradition. And each constellation in his book is actually depicted twice, once as it would appear on a celestial globe, and once as it appears to an observer under the open sky. And so this inventive visual technique acknowledged the relativity of perspective. And it's a subtle nod to the idea that how we map the stars really depends on our point of view. It also made the book a very practical observing aid. And Al-Sufi explicitly intended that his illustrated charts, not just as displays of learning, but that they became tools of direct observation of the night sky as well. And Al-Sufi's work really exemplifies epistemic translation at the crossroads of cultures, working from the Arabic translation of Ptolemy's Almagest. He noted that stars had shifted in the centuries since Ptolemy, due to precession. And then he tries to offer corrections for his own era. And so he also includes stars Ptolemy hadn't recorded and gave them Arabic names alongside the Greek ones, effectively creating this sort of bicultural star catalog. And in one striking example where Ptolemy saw the figure of Princess Andromeda, Arab astronomers saw a pair of fish in the same cluster of stars. And Al-Sufi literally combines the images so that the fish bisects Andromeda's body and overlapping two cosmologies in one visual scheme. The star that lay at this overlap he describes very evocatively as Al-Latka al-Sahibia, which is the nebulous smear. And so in this sort of very layered description, we can almost see the palimpsest in action, right? The Greek mythological figure and the Arab animal drawn over the same patch of sky, each partially observing the other. And it's a very powerful metaphor for the cultural layering of knowledge. And, it's an acknowledgement that even as one system dominates, it cannot fully erase the outlines of the other. So yeah, these star charts were very significant for Empire because part of the answer lies in their visual abstraction. By using grids, by using diagrams, by using schematic images, Abbasid era astronomers turned the sky into a kind of parchment. And the celestial sphere was projected onto flat paper with reference grids and coordinates that really allowed precise measurements and predictions. And so this abstraction made knowledge very portable and standardized, and it's a necessary quality for imperial science because imperial science seeks uniformity across vast territories. So the choice paper, which was more often than not vellum, a medium really mattered. because like I said, it was portable. You could easily reproduce it, and so a paper star chart could be copied and circulated from, for example, Baghdad's House of Wisdom to far-flung observatories in East Asia. Indeed, the life of al-Sufi's book really illustrates this imperial circulation. One copy, history tells us, survived the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, and it was rescued by astronomer Nasser ad-Din al-Tusi, who then offered it to Hulagu Khan and then convinces him to build an observatory. Now, the Marga, this is the very famous Marga Observatory, which was completed in, I believe, 1247, and then it was abandoned in 1250. There was just some internal resistance happening at the empire then. But I'm highlight this because a work on paper directly inspired brick and mortar architecture. You know, the famed Marga Observatory was born from a translated manuscript, and it's an intermedial leap from page to building. Later in the 15th century, we also see Sultan Ulugh Beg in Samarkand, who himself was an emperor and astronomer, and goes on to commission a new observatory and a new illustrated copy and produced updated star tables. And so each imperial hand that received the star charts added new layers of annotations and refinements, but also inevitably pruned away some local particularities. For example, when al-Sufi preserved Arabic star lore, later Islamic star atlases became increasingly more technical and sometimes shedding methodological imagery in favor of more pure coordinates and tables. Yet traces of suppressed ontologies still clung to these paper skies. The Abbasid star charts served a double role. They were tools of knowledge conversion and cultural hierarchy, certainly, but also repositories of relational cosmologies, you know, keeping alive older ways of relating to the stars, albeit in footnotes and margins. Al-Sufi's careful inclusion of pre-Islamic star names in his two perspective drawings are acts of translation that acknowledge multiple viewpoints. We might read them as subtle resistance to epistemicide, a refusal to let one worldview entirely efface another. Nonetheless, in framing the Arab constellations within the Ptolemaic system, al-Sufi's atlas visually subordinated the indigenous Arabian sky to the Greco-Arabic synthesis. And so the logic of layout, the Eurocentric, or rather Greco-centric constellation figures centered on each page reflect this hierarchy of knowledge. The Arabic star lore appears as enriching detail, but the overall structure still proclaims the primacy of the classical 48 constellations. And so in this way, the star charts mirror the Abbasid translation movement itself, open to other cultures' wisdom, yet also confidently asserting a universalizing order under the banner of the.
Oh, you've cut out, I'm afraid. The audio just dropped out.
Okay, how's that? I'm so sorry about all of this. Okay. Right. So fast forward to the 17th century in Beijing, and we find another empire gazing up at the stars through foreign knowledge. The Qing dynasty's young Kangxi emperor sits at the center of a vast realm, concerned, like many Chinese rulers before him, with astronomy as statecraft. In imperial China, the accuracy of the calendar and the timing of celestial events weren't just academic matters, they were deeply political. They were tied to the emperor's mixed eclipse or an errant planetary prediction could be read as a sign that heaven withdrew its mandate from the throne. Astronomy, in short, was power, and Kangxi knew this. Into this high-stakes environment stepped a group of Jesuit missionaries armed with telescopes, star charts, and the latest astronomical tables from Europe. And so what ensued is this dramatic encounter of knowledge systems, one that played out both in the skies but also on paper. At first, the Jesuits were outsiders. They were learned ones, but they were in a court that had its own rich astronomical tradition. Chinese astronomy had, for millennia, developed independent of Ptolemy or Galileo, with its own constellations, star atlases, and a sophisticated court astronomical bureau. In fact, the bureau even included a Muslim astronomy division. And by the 1640s, the Jesuit father, Johann Adam Schall von Bell, had become very influential in this bureau, helping to reform the Chinese calendar. Schall's skill in predicting eclipses won him favor with the Ming and then Qing courts as well, but such influence bred resentment. The tensions reached a head in the 1660s when the traditionalist astronomers accused Schall and the Jesuits of malpractice. And then in a turn of events, Schall was imprisoned and nearly escaped execution. Kangshi's ascent to full power in 1669 marked a turning point. The young emperor, who was very intrigued by Western science and perhaps recognizing its utility, called for famous astronomical contest. So we have the Jesuit Ferdinand Verbiest, who was pitted against the Chinese court astronomer Yang Gongzhuan to predict various celestial phenomena. Verbiest, who was armed with the latest European tables and a telescope, triumphed in all three tests. And so the verdict was clear. And the verdict was that Western astronomy outperformed the Chinese methods. And so the emperor promptly installed Verbiest as the director of the Imperial Observatory and the head of the Astronomical Bureau, effectively handing the keys of the heaven mandate to the Jesuits. And so with the backing of the emperor, Jesuits set about overhauling the infrastructure of Chinese astronomy, not just recalculating the calendar, but also redesigning the very instruments by which the skies were observed. And so under Verbiest and his colleagues, the visual and material culture of Chinese astronomy was transformed. They designed and cast new enormous bronze instruments for the Beijing Observatory. You have sextants, celestial globes, all sorts of instruments that were calibrated to European astronomical principles. But these grand devices had their paper counterparts, star charts, maps, reports that really codified the new knowledge. Verbiest is known to have created star charts for the emperor in order to tell the time at night. And so the Jesuits literally expand the Chinese cosmos and extending its map to the entire sort of globe. They introduced Latinized constellations of Europe, Ursa Major, Orion, Cassiopeia, and so on, at least in their own records and teachings. And how were these Western constellations presented in China? Well, often the Jesuits drew equivalencies between Western and Chinese star groups, and they would translate constellation names and even graft new stars onto the existing Chinese star map. And so the King Court published new atlases that showed both systems, Chinese star mansions alongside the Western zodiac and constellations. And so on paper, this process can be seen in the observatory reports and star catalogs that the Jesuits produced. These documents, some of which were bilingual in Chinese and Latin, were the textual complement to the new observatory instruments. They contain tables of planetary positions, eclipse positions, and star positions calculated with logarithms and European methods. And sometimes they would also describe phenomena using concepts novel to China. For example, the moons of Jupiter that were discovered by Galileo, or the elliptical orbits of planets. So while the primary motive was pragmatic, to maintain the calendar and impress the emperor, there was an overtone of what I would argue was a cultural hierarchy in these works. The Jesuits politely but firmly conveyed that their astronomy was the cutting edge and that Chinese traditions, however venerable, needed correction. So the emperor and his successors patronized this new knowledge because it really strengthened imperial control. With accurate predictions and maps, the throne could claim command over time, space, and cosmos. And so, in effect, Western astronomy was co-opted to serve the mandate of heaven, even as it quietly displaced the intellectual authority of generations of Chinese astronomers. And yet the story isn't one of simple replacement. The King Imperial sky under Kangxi became this layered entity, a palimpsest of Chinese and European star knowledge. You think about this globe, a replica of 1673. This blending is evident. The globe would have had the Chinese constellations carved on it, as well as the newly added stars and perhaps Western constellation outlines. And so we know that Chinese scholars continue to use their star names and refer to the traditional star atlas for cultural and ritual purposes, even as they employed Jesuit data for calculations. In court ceremonies, the emperor would still pay homage at the Temple of the Heaven in essentially the same way, but now the experts that were ensuring the calendar's correctness were Jesuit trained. And so, in effect, the king sky became bilingual. Paperworks like the Jesuits' observatory reports were a key interface for this bilingual sky, and they were translating back and forth between the two knowledge system. And so, I would also argue that this creates a richer intellectual climate, expanding the known cosmos to Chinese astronomers, but also imposing a new hierarchy of knowledge, with Western methods claiming the top. And so, examining these sort of two cases side by side, we begin to appreciate that the intermedial nature of imperial knowledge production, right? In both the Abbasid and King examples, the works on papers, the star charts, the reports, the maps, didn't exist in a vacuum. They were entangled with other media and practices, architecture, instruments, rituals, oral narratives, in a circularity of knowledge exchange. In the Abbasid case, we see how a manuscript star atlas spurred the construction of an observatory. The knowledge that was inscribed on paper leapt to stone and brass. Firstly, the observational practices at the observatory would feed back into new tables, new diagrams on paper. And so thus, paper and architecture work in tandem, and they're each informing the other. And Islamic astronomy had practical applications in ritual calendars as well, right? The star charts indirectly affirmed religious and imperial power by enabling precise timekeeping for these widely observed rituals. And then in King China, the intermedial dance was, if anything, even more elaborate. The Jesuits' works on paper, whether they're letters to Europe describing their progress, or printed star maps, or internal reports to the emperor, were intimately linked with performative and spatial practices. The Imperial Observatory in Beijing became a grand stage where East and West met. Enormous European design instruments stood alongside older Chinese ones. Jesuits and Chinese officials together observed the heavens and then went inside to consult star charts. And there is this architectural dimension too. The design of the Beijing Observatory itself, perched on the city wall, symbolized the emperor's surveillance over the sky. It was partly a Jesuit achievement in engineering, but it also served a Chinese imperial purpose, making tangible the slogan "as above, so below." I just want to acknowledge that print culture and global circulation, when we think about Jesuit star maps and reports, they didn't only stay in China. There were copies of their findings that made their way back to Europe. For example, Verbies published recounting his Chinese triumphs. And so thus paper works, again, as a two-way bridge. Western knowledge flows into China on paper, but Chinese skies and perhaps some Chinese knowledge flowed out to Europe through Jesuit writings. And so this was truly an intermedial exchange spanning manuscripts, printed books, engraved maps, and even performances. It's a reminder that works on paper, especially in imperial contexts, often aim for wide dissemination. They are meant to be copied, to be shared, or at least archived in a permanent record. So both the Abbasid and King cases also illustrate a form of cultural exchange that is asymmetrical. In each, you have a dominant epistemology sought to translate another. Sometimes this meant genuine synthesis, as El-Sufi attempted, trying to mold Greek and Arabic star lore together, and other times it meant overriding the local system as the Jesuits did, replacing Chinese methods with European ones. And so in the language of today's visual culture studies, we can say that these paper artifacts reveal the power dynamics of seeing. Who gets to chart the skies? Whose perspective is centered and whose is pushed back to the margins? The Abbasid star charts center Greek constellations but annotate with Arabic. The Jesuit charts center European constellation and coordinate grids, appending Chinese star names, perhaps in the margins or below. And so the layout and composition of these documents are themselves arguments about whose knowledge is normative. So, as I conclude, in these explorations of Abbasid and King star papers, we've witnessed very briefly how the sky was transformed into an object of imperial understanding through visual abstraction, the use of grids, projections, diagrams. Infinite space was tamed on a page, and through epistemic translation, which is the conversion of one culture's cosmology into another framework, knowledge was then made legible and loyal to empire. And through material practices, the reproduction of charts, the building of observatories, the performance of celestial prediction, the authority of those paper skies was enacted and enforced. And so each new star chart or observatory report came with an implicit narrative that the cosmos could be known in a singular, authoritative way, and that the empire, be it the Abbasid or the king, had now grasped that way. And yet, as I've emphasized, these works on paper are palimpsests, not blank states, right? Scraped beneath the surface of a Jesuit map of the Beijing sky, one will still find the shadow of the purple forbidden enclosure or the 28 mansions of Chinese star lore. Hidden in the corners of Al-Sufi's diagrams are of ostriches and frogs and fish. Are Arabic star lore that survived Islamic orthodoxy. So recognizing these layered presences is a key step in what decolonial scholars today would call unmapping the sky. To unmap is not to erase the scientific achievements of these empires, but to peel back the layers and see the cosmological struggles that each layer represents. The goal is to not romanticize these alternatives, but to revalue them as legitimate ways of knowing the sky, ways that coexisted with and sometimes resisted the imperial narrative of linear progress. Decolonial theory urges us to remember that knowledge has a geography and a politics. And so in closing, I just return back to the symposium's theme, Impressions of Empire, works on paper as agents of intermedial translation and cultural exchange. The Abbasid and King star papers were indeed agents of translation, translating skies into scriptures of empire, and agents of exchange, albeit unequal exchange. They remind us that the impressions of empire were not only left on lands and peoples, but in the very constellations under which those people lived. Empire left its imprint on the heavens by way of these paper tools, but the heavens were never fully colonized. The night sky above Baghdad or Beijing remained in lived experience as vast and untamed as ever, still open to a myriad of stories. So perhaps the final impression we should take away is one of humility. No matter how much ink is spilled to grid the sky, the stars always invite new readings. Today, scholars like myself and communities around the world are attempting to read the stars as kin rather than conquest. By unraveling the layers of imperial abstraction, we don't just lose knowledge, we actually gain plurality. We can appreciate the Abbasid star chart and the Jesuit map for what they taught, while also listening to the silent songs of the stars that echo behind them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Asha. That was really, really interesting, and I think a really sort of lovely and poetic way to sort of end this symposium in a lot of ways. I really liked a comment that you made about infinite space was tamed on a page. And I think that, when you're talking about something as vast as space, it really does, I think, put in perspective like a lot of the ideas that we've been engaging with over the last few days. I think that, and this sense again and again that we've sort of heard over the last few hours of, the applicability of this intermedial translation at the heart of all these ideas, in the sense that works on paper or this intermedial exchange can push the boundaries of what art can be, but it also can come at the cost of, more ephemeral forms of knowledge. With that, I'd like to open the questions to everyone here. So please let me know if anyone's got a comment or a question, something to add. Go for it.
Question, Asher, for you. Thank you. Your paper was beautiful and often poetic to listen to. I was interested by the importance of prediction in the Chinese context that you described, the capacity of Jesuits to accurately predict astronomical events. And I was wondering if you could say more about the role that prediction played in images. Are there predictive, prospective images that are representing things that will happen in the future?
Thank you so much for the comment. I really appreciate it. And the question is excellent. So that's a great question. You often find a lot of predictive imagery in more European contexts than sort of Chinese and Islamic. Now, you bring up a great point in the context of China, but also in the context of the Islamic Empire. Both empires, both cultures relied heavily on predictions because it was tied so much into religion. And you find that with a lot of indigenous and global South cultures is that when we, for example, think about excavating a structure that's been cosmologically aligned or it's aligned through the cardinal directions, these sort of places that we find were intersections of religion, culture, social structure. And so being master of the heavens ties into this idea that Kangxi really fed into is like the divine ruler, right? Divine emperor. And somewhat you'll find that in the Abbasid Caliphate as well, but it's a little bit more different because there's more religious implications in terms of predictions, especially when as it pertains to the Muslims. But in Chinese lore, because there were rituals and big grand feasts happening at court and celebrations taking place, having knowledge of astronomical phenomena that was going to occur before it happened was a way of the emperor being able to exert his authority, his divine presence on the subjects as well. So that really feeds into this idea. And at the time, the King Empire had this sort of motto of mandate of heaven and really to affirm the connection between emperor and the heavens themselves. And so the Jesuits, yeah, that's why it was such an interesting influx. They arrived at this sort of moment in time where things were looking a little bit fragile and unstable in the empire, and then all of a sudden you have the Jesuits that come in and showcase this new learned knowledge that they're bringing in from Europe. It works both ways. Like they're able to extract the Chinese star lore information and bring it back to Europe, and then the Chinese emperor and his the ones around him are able to benefit from that too. So I hope that answers your question. I feel like I went on a bit of a tangent there.
Can I ask you, Usher, just on this topic of religion, kind of how did this sort of, the openness to Jesuit knowledge of astronomy, do you find that there are tensions that arise with, of course, their Catholic mission in China, and how does the emperor negotiate that in a way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one of the things that I've been recently looking to is sort of post Silk Road, post Mongol Empire, because I feel like for me, this has been a big part of my thesis research. And I myself look at three cultures. We've got the ancestral Puebloans in the US, we've got the Abbasid Empire, and then I'm actually looking at the Northern Sung dynasty, so a couple centuries before the King, the Ming and the Qing dynasties. But for me, what I'm really researching at this moment in time and drawing connections is the cultural transmission and translation that was occurring under the Mongols, and how eventually when you have the Mongol Empire that then disintegrates, and you have the king and the Mings coming up. Is that how much of that tolerance do I see coming up in a lot of these court documents and interactions? And for me, I'm trying to draw similarities there. It can be a tough subject at time because a lot of these archival records, for me at least, I've struggled to get my hands on them because they're not available publicly, or they haven't been translated from Chinese to say English, or a lot of these archival documents are with the government in China, so it's hard to access them. And so there are some missing links there. That's a topic that I'm really interested in exploring more, is trying to get to the bottom of, like you say, how tense were these interactions, and there is this element of tolerance, but what was really happening on this stage? And so I would say, for me, the scholarship there is lacking a little bit, I'll be honest with you, but it's something that I'm continuously trying to push and look into as much as I can.
If on, I mean, I study an earlier period, so I don't quite know about this, but if from the Jesuit side, you have communication about this going back to Europe, how they're, I mean, and I know often many of the Jesuit missionaries found that kind of assimilating in their dress and learning the language and all of that was, of course, very helpful in kind of pursuing their mission. And the exchange of knowledge obviously was probably employed with that, end view of ultimately Catholic mission, but fascinating. But Anne-Marie, I would love to just we've had a few, I mean, we've had all these wonderful cases of sort of seeing how works on paper can kind of promote an agenda of control, through bodies, landscapes, and now the sky, it's the heavens. And there have been a few instances that we've seen where, though, there are cases of resistance. And I think, your those preparatory drawings and the beautiful visual analysis that you did there sort of demonstrated that. But I wondered if, it's quite subtle. And is this an isolated case, or do you see, does this sort of Modernismo group do more of this? I mean, could you put it a little bit more in the kind of context of the wider artistic movement, and this idea of kind of resistance and
Yes, that's a great question. So a few things come to mind. The first is that Ramon Casas is a brilliant artist, but a difficult historical subject. And that, in comparison with some of his colleagues, I can name names, he was much less open about his views, personal, political. Put simply, he wrote a lot less about what he thought and felt. This is somewhat ironic because he took on a great number of overtly political subjects in the 1890s, was really engaged with a lot of the big questions of the day in Barcelona. Ironic because his closest collaborator and friend during this period, Santiago Rusiñol, was a prolific writer. We know a lot about what he thought. He, among other things, published novels, plays, poems, essays that openly criticize any number of figures, civil and military authorities. But the art of Rusiñol, I think, lacks the incisive critique that I often see in the work of Casas. But I agree with you, it's subtle. One of the directions that I would like to take this current research project has to do with a different figure in the painting and the preparatory drawings, a figure I didn't discuss today, who is on horseback and appears to be a member of the Guardia Civil, the sort of despised by many police authority throughout Spain at this time. And I think digging into that horseback figure would help make some of the subtle criticisms in these drawings and in the painting more overt and visible to us.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you both.
Any more questions, comments?
I was just going to also thank both Anne-Marie and Usher for wonderful presentations. Anne-Marie, I spent a lot of time in Sitges, so I know Santiago Rossignol's house very well, and I know exactly what you mean about his works are quite conservative, aren't they? They stick, well, at least what's hanging in the house and what I've seen in Barcelona is he spent quite a lot of time in Paris, didn't he? And he stuck pretty closely to what he saw. I mean, he went through all sorts of different styles, but he didn't seem to infuse them with a lot of his own personal kind of ideological kind of political thoughts. But I thought it was really interesting. And I just wanted to ask you, so those preparatory drawings, maybe you said this, but I've been kind of trying to catch so much, I might have missed it. How far did they circulate, the preparatory drawings? I mean, who had seen them, and you know?
Yeah, this is another great question and area of active research for me at the moment. So I would say definitively that their widest circulation was in newspapers, magazines, journals, where they were reproduced. I looked at just one example today, an example that dates to 1897, when a single preparatory drawing was reproduced in a New Year's Day supplement of La Vanguardia, this leading newspaper in Barcelona and Catalonia at the time, and now for that matter. Casas had worked for this newspaper as a regular contributor and illustrator throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s. And it's interesting to me that this drawing was selected to appear in the newspaper because, as I said, it was so very different from the newspaper's earlier representations of the war, which really emphasized portraiture, individual bust-length portraits of high-ranking military officials, in many cases generals. And so to have this drawing in the newspaper, I think, was something of a departure. But more in line, I think, with where coverage of the war was headed at this moment in time. So there are a few later cases in which these preparatory drawings were reproduced in periodicals. I'm interested in their shifting meaning at different points in time. I think the drawings meant one thing when the war was still ongoing, when there was a possibility that Cuba, the ever faithful isle, would remain faithful, would remain a Spanish colonial possession. And they meant something very different beyond 1898, when it no longer did. I think even the same drawing can take on or can elicit very different interpretations in those kind of two historical moments, before the so-called disaster and after the so-called disaster.
Thank you, and Usher, what a fantastic talk! What a great way for us to end, as Bianca said, and Anne-Marie and Irene, everybody, you know, that it was poetic, it was just wonderful, and such interesting images too. And I'm just summing up and thanking you all. I think I'm just completely blown away by the range of papers we've had over the last 2 days. So thank you all so much. I think the kind of work that you're doing is, and the whole focus on these intermedial translations is really a new way of thinking about art history today.